Good afternoon.
How you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. Glad we're finally doing this.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
Let's see here. I will
Are you
make you co-host. So
okay? I was going to ask, will you enable the share screen so I can just make sure that my document pulls up?
yeah, that should work. Let's see here. Because do you see it as you see yourself as co-host, correct?
It looks like
Yes.
it. Can you
Yep,
see my document?
looks like you're good. Yep.
Okay. As long as you can see it.
Yep. Got it.
Okay.
Perfect.
I'll stop the
Sounds
share.
good. Excellent.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and we did just a quick little run through with Don the other day. So
Yeah, I figured that.
yeah, he just really wanted to make sure more or less that he was, comfortable sharing his screen. So all went
Yeah,
well.
after teaching online for almost 2 years, I'm zoomed out.
I know. That's one of the things I've been thinking about with work too, because initially nobody was quite sure how it was working, and now everybody kind of feels like we've done it.
Yeah.
Certainly been there. So perfect. So yeah, I had a number of people reach out to me just in the last couple of days asking for the login information.
Okay,
So
well, we'll see if anyone shows up.
yeah. If not, it'll be a nice little discussion.
We can chat.
Yeah.
I've been in big ones, I've been in real small ones.
Yeah, a lot of it kind of depends on the day. I mean, that's where we kind of settled on 2:00, that it seemed like we had a little bit better turnout, just not as close to lunch.
Yeah.
But with the weather being great, you never know.
Yeah, summertime on the weekend is harder than in the middle of January.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I assume we'll just go ahead and save the questions until you're done speaking. And then I'll just be monitoring the chat, and I'll filter in some of those, and then we can open it up to just a free for all for questions. So
let's do it.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Let's do it. I can't remember. About a year and a half ago, maybe almost 2 years ago, were you at the Black Sox meeting in Chicago?
I was there.
And the tour?
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. I was there. Yeah, and then I know I randomly met you at the Brewers game.
Yes.
A couple of years ago.
Yep,
You were a few rows behind.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So yeah, my wife's the Brewers fan. So
okay.
So we're up there 4 or 5 times a year. So
oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Were you at one of Rick's tailgating? I can't recall if it was first at the tailgating and then probably at the game itself.
Yeah, I haven't done any of the tailgating or ballpark games. I've been up there for a few of their chapter meetings, but mainly like at a bar, restaurant, those type of events. So
I normally, before the games in Milwaukee, I go to the place on Blue Mound right by the park. That's only a 15 minute.
Yeah, we actually like to go to Oscars.
Okay.
Everyone
there's so many nice places nearby. They all have the bus service to the park.
Yeah.
And that's your favorite little bar to go to.
Yeah.
Mine is please call J&G.
Okay.
Well, whoever set this up, thank you for putting the White Sox password and White Sox passcode in there.
I figure it needed something a little more specific than our generic ones. So
I grew up on the South Side in Blue Island, and so I can remember the night they won the pennant in 1959 when we thought Chicagoland was under nuclear attack. So
sure.
I've been a White
I can imagine.
I've been a White Sox fan since his first go around with since Minnie Minoso's first go around with the White Sox.
Sure.
Ever jump over the railing and onto the field?
This Cub fans are going to be ready to party like it's 1959.
Yeah. I guess this is where I do admit, full disclosure, I'm actually a Cubs fan, but I come from a long, extended White Sox family. So
Good. I'm relocated to Minnesota now, so I've got the Twins just a couple miles away from me, though. But I'm looking forward to the White Sox. Actually, I have them on TV right now in the Yankee game, though. So I'm looking forward to this season's White Sox team, though, because they really awesome. Though.
Yeah. Are they still losing 3-0? That's I thought it was 5-0 now, though, too. But they're down. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. But they're in first place. So.
Yes, that's what counts. Yes.
And don't be confused. The other Bill Perch is actually my dad. So.
I decided to join you. I decided to join you guys today because 2 weeks ago we just had our semi-annual Halsey Hall meeting here in the Twin Cities via Zoom. But I usually go. I usually. Stop into the Keltner chapter and the Baltimore chapter, though. I haven't checked you guys out for a while, but I see you've got a couple of good authors on the agenda for today, though.
We certainly do. So yeah, we've been doing a lot in terms of Zoom. So we've been able to get a great number of presenters on a wide range of topics. So it's out of everything that's been going on with all the craziness, there's certainly been a little bit of good that we've been able to incorporate this into what we're doing and reach people we wouldn't normally be able to get in contact with. Yeah,
that's been one of the positives in regards to the past year here, though, too. We're doing it. I've hosted a number of author presentations just in the past few months here, though, and we've got one coming up on Monday night as well, too. So, but yeah, they've gone over pretty well, though, too. And I think people are going to want to keep them up, though, as well, too, as, being subordinate to the regular meetings, but still, being able to stay in touch, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was one of we sent out a survey to our chapter, to our membership, and that was one of the questions that came up. It was really like, how often do you want to meet in person? Do you want to continue the virtual? Do you want to do a mix? How do you want that to happen? So we're working on making sense of the results that we ended up collecting and really kind of coming up with a plan for making that happen moving forward. So yeah.
Yeah, we're going to be having our first in-person event in a few weeks in St. Paul. Our bi-monthly book club meeting here, though. So
okay.
It's going to be interesting to see how that goes and what people's thoughts are about, how to proceed in the future, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll mention it too, but we're going to do a little lunch in Wrigleyville on a non-game day as a little bit of a test of getting back in person, because we were going back and forth on that. Should we just look at a game day and see what's going on? And we're like, no, let's just kind of ease into that. Let's just make sure the Cubs are out of town. So.
Yeah, those kind of events are really cool too, because we've got now that the Twins have the Saints only 10 miles away in St. Paul, though. We're gonna try to do some events with the Saints as well too.
Sure.
Coming season.
Perfect.
Hey
and
guys,
Don, glad you can
Jason.
join us. I just added you as a co-host, so when we get to you, you should be able to jump in and share your screen at that point. So.
Bill,
So
can you hear me?
Both of our speakers here. And who's that?
Yes, I'm here.
Perfect.
Jason, where are you?
You know what? I'm in the car, but I'm not driving, so no worries.
Okay.
Jody's doing the driving for
There's
me.
your proof.
Yeah. But I couldn't miss this, so I was tuning in from the car.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Jason, I
You're
sent
not
you that
driving.
email, so we should be good. Whatever date works out for you and Mike. So
Yeah, thank you. Perfect.
yeah.
Bill, I know you do this anyway, but I just want to make sure that you record this meeting. Since I sent out the notice yesterday, I've already had 2 people say to me, "Oh, yeah, I can't make it. I really want to see it. Can you get it recorded?" So
Yeah,
that's
yeah. I see the record going right now, so we'll be in good shape. Yeah, a few of the guys in my fantasy baseball league said that too. They're like, I'm tied up on Saturday afternoon usually, but if it's recorded, they're all recorded. So.
You know, there's lots of White Sox fans out there.
There are.
We're not doing much this afternoon, but
Yeah.
And,
Hey,
and-
but they're still in
and
first place, right?
yeah, they're fine.
About half the White Sox fans out there were even fans before this season.
Mm-hmm.
There is one Giants fan here.
I'm sorry to hear that.
You're just envious. No.
Turn left onto Downers Drive.
Well, I'm sure Jason's thinking, gee, yeah, Giants could celebrate being in first place today, but 2 days from now, not so sure.
We'll take our
Exactly.
chances.
I'm still waiting for my first Saber meeting where there's another Dodger fan besides me. I don't think it's happened yet, but one of these
Right.
days.
Hey, they're my second favorite team.
Yeah,
that
okay,
good?
there we go. And at least someone else is representing the NL West, even if it's the Giants.
Oh my gosh. Boston?
There's a Boston fan. I feel it.
With Dennis Eckersley's hair hanging off the back.
And hi, Sharon. So that makes this meeting officially international, correct?
Yes, that's obviously why I joined. So you could say that in your byline.
Right.
It was a totally successful international meeting, and you could say we crossed borders even before we're allowed to.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Brian.
Yes.
Hey, Brian.
Hello. Hey, Richard. How are you?
Good. God, your house looks like mine.
It's not my house. My man cave.
Man cave. Well, whatever.
My wife would not allow anything like this in the house. I'm a researcher. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
The books need to go somewhere.
Yeah. Did you get your questions answered about Comiskey Park?
No, I have no answers to any of my questions. I'm really struggling with a big aspect of it, and I'm glad I get to see with my own eyes the legendary Bob Webster and Don Zminda and all those guys. It's a real honor.
Yeah, because you were short, right? But I couldn't
Yeah,
quite tell what you're looking for.
Here's what I'm looking for. So for those who don't know, I've been a long time Wrigley Field historian. I'm the individual who put the historic marker where the Westwood Grounds was. And I'm
Perfect. Well, we'll give everybody a couple more minutes and then we'll, because there's still a wave of people popping in here. So, and then we'll get going.
Yeah.
And I am going to mute everybody. So if our speakers can unmute themselves at when they're ready, we'll do that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, looks like we're up to 28. We're pushing 30 people right now. So this is a great attendance. So if you're ready, we can certainly get started. Let me hit admit there. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. We have a very White Sox focused meeting today. So it's only natural that you get a Cubs fan moderating. So I tried to deck myself out with as much Comiskey Park garb and White Sox cups that I can to help create the mood for today. But today we're going to focus on two different books that have a White Sox connection. And obviously the White Sox are in first place right now. There are certainly a lot of reasons they're in the news, and we can save that for the end of the meeting to really get into some of the nuts and bolts of that. But for today's focus, we're really going to look back. And our first speaker is Dr. Wolf, and he will be talking about a book about Old Comiskey Park that was a publication by Saber. And then our second speaker is Don Zminda, and he's going to talk about his book, which deals with the Black Sox scandal specific to the trial in 1920. So I would like to do a quick introduction. Well, first of all, we will have the two presenters. I'll be monitoring the chat. Everybody will be on mute. So feel free to fire some questions through the chat. I will get to those. And once each speaker is finished, then we'll open it up for a little bit of a free-for-all to ask your questions, and then I'll filter in some of the questions or comments that come in through the chat. So that's how we'll handle that today. But let's just jump right in. Our very first speaker is Dr. Gregory Wolf. Quick little bio. Dr. Wolf was born in Pittsburgh, but now resides in the Chicagoland area with his wife, Margaret, and daughter, Gabriella. A professor of German studies and holder of the Dennis and Jean Bauman Endowed Chair in the Humanities at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois. He has edited a dozen books for Saber. He is currently working on projects about Shibe Park in Philadelphia and Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. Since January 2017, he's been co-director of Saber's Bio Project, and you can follow the Bio Project on Facebook and Twitter. And he will specifically be talking about the book published through Saber. He served as the editor, The Baseball Palace of the World, Comiskey Park. And the little note that's on Saber's website about the book, I won't read the whole thing, but The Baseball Palace of the World, Comiskey Park is Saber's humble volume, which aims to evoke memories of Chicago's storied ballpark and introduce others to its exciting history through detailed summaries of more than 80 games played there and several feature essays. The volume is a collaborative and tireless effort of 50 Saber members, which I am proud to say I was one of them. My contribution to this particular book was my first Saber contribution outside of our chapter newsletter. So I had the privilege of writing about Game 2 of the 1918 World Series between the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs, and the Cubs won. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Wolf. Oh, and I think you're on mute. So
Thanks a lot, Bill. I appreciate the invitation. I don't know about you all, but after teaching for the last year and a half online exclusively, I'm zoomed out probably like you are. But I really appreciate the invitation on a Saturday. My daughter is in a travel volleyball league. And if you know anything about travel volleyball, you know those tournaments last 12 hours a day, both Saturdays and Sundays. So I've been able to leave the tournament to come back home and spend a few hours by myself. So I appreciate that a chance too. It's been a while since I've been at one of the Chicago chapter meetings on Saturdays, especially because of what we typically are doing on Saturdays with some kind of sports with my daughter. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the book that Saber published that I edited. All of you are aware of those volumes that Saber has published. Bill is here, Bill Nolan. He could probably say a lot about that. But we've been publishing anywhere between 8 and 10 volumes a year over about the past 5 or 6 years. And I encourage you to take a look at these volumes. All of you can get free copies, but the nice versions are really the bound copies, the paperback copies that you can buy. They cost about $20. Oh, good, but you have one out. They're all professionally done. And like you mentioned, Bill, these are a collaborative effort on behalf of a lot of people. This one happened to be 50 people. I was the lead editor, but the work is done by a myriad of volunteers. Bill was one of the assistant editors, associate editors, I should say. We have fact checkers, we have copy editors, who do everything. A book project, a typical Saber book project like this is about 2 years from the time that there's a call for authors for the games that we chose to its final end result. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer, sometimes it takes a little bit less. It depends on if it's a very topical book that needs a specific slot date for its publication. And these books are not cheap to make. We have them all professionally done. We have to procure images. Sometimes we receive free images, but these are expensive books to make. So I just wanted to mention that to start off with. And I do appreciate your work, Bill, publicizing all of Saber's publications right now and trying to advocate as much as we possibly can for that. It's a very big undertaking for Saber. Before I even get to, everyone can see this document right now? Okay, before I even get to that, I want to say a few things about what I'm doing for Saber right now, and that's namely the Saber Bio Project. I hope you all are aware of it. Some of you have contributed to it, and I hope that all of you consider contributing to it. The Saber Bio Project is actually the biggest name that Saber has in terms of getting its research out. We have a completely newly redeveloped design for our website. Right now, we have around 5,600 bios that we've published. All of those go through multiple vetting, fact checking, and editing stages right here. This is our new interface. You can check things out here. It's organized through a bunch of different kinds of topics, from players, topics, ballparks, etc. So I would like you to think about doing that. We've had 460 new bios this year. In addition to that, I wanted to mention something about our BioProject Twitter page. Can everyone see this Twitter page? Bill, you can see that? We have almost 15,000 followers on Twitter. It's actually the biggest advocate for Saber right now. We have more traffic on the BioProject Twitter page than we do have on the national web page. Typically, I'm putting out about 5 to 10 pages. We have somewhere around 20 million impressions per month on Twitter right now. And
actually, right now I'm just seeing the Buck Weaver image.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I wanted to make sure that everyone is that you all can see that and have a chance to maybe go and check something on our Twitter. We have a lot of feedback on Twitter, and we also have a very engaged Facebook interaction for BioProject. Now we have around 3.5 followers and a lot of discussion about research. A lot of authors are posting things if they're really looking for anything about the whole research endeavor. So those are things that I encourage you all to maybe be involved in. We have a good, I think, a good cadre of volunteers as well as participants in all of those various social media efforts. But maybe a little bit about this book. We've had a number of books concentrating on stadiums. I did one on Wrigley Field about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and this one came out last year sometime, maybe about 9 months ago. I think we have 85 games here. 50 different people contributed to it. Of course, it starts with the first game, opening day, July 10th, 1910. It was a loss to the Browns. That game, until the final game in 1990, there's almost 6,300 games played in Comiskey Park. One of the things that I like to do with the books that I've edited for Saber that have focused on specifically parks, I've done one on Crosley Field, I mentioned Wrigley Field, on Sportsman's Park, on the Houston Astrodome, is there might be a question, how do we tell the history of the park? How do we tell the history of, let's say, a team or teams, if multiple teams play in a park? How do we do that through a series of games played in that park? In other words, there has to be some kind of motif that brings all of these games together. It's just not randomly chosen. So it might be a question for us: how do we tell history through these volumes that Saber's published? Well, you can imagine who started the first game in Wrigley Field, in Comiskey Park. That was Ed Walsh. Anyone know anything about Ed Walsh? Do you like anything specifically? What's your favorite thing about Ed Walsh? Anyone have any trivia, any information they like about him specifically?
Yeah, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself and answer if you'd like.
He helped design the ballpark.
What's that?
He helped design the ballpark.
Helped design the ballpark. Of course, with the Barber ball, pitcher who's I think apex of his career spanned both ballparks, South Side and this. But he lost that first game. I just put a few statistics up here. He lost that first game to another interesting figure, Bernie Pelty of the Browns. I think an interesting thing about this is not just that the ballpark was completed in 4 months from February to July, but a lot of things going on at the ballpark on that day. Almost 100 degrees at the ballpark. You have the mayor there, you have the festivities there, and a figure like this, Barney Pelty, a forgotten figure today, but about 1/4 of all of his decisions, he went around 90 and 110 in his career, but 50 of his decisions either ended in a shutout that he threw or his team, the Browns, were shut out by. And as I mentioned, the final game ends in September 30th, 1990. Did anyone go to this game? I think Alan, I don't know if Alan, I thought I saw Alan Reifman's name. Who attended this game? Anyone here? No one? We had a number of people who contributed to the
I did. I was there.
You were there. What do you remember about it, Tim?
Yep.
Well, do you have any specific memories about it that you enjoyed?
Yeah, I was just sad because I didn't think they should have torn the park down. I think they should have remodeled it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it was sad because they were, on the cusp of being a very good team. And I think they probably would have, sold really well the next 3 or 4 years in that park if they would have remodeled it. So
I think for me, what I like about these Saber books, whether they are focusing on a specific team or a park, it's an opportunity to remember some figures whose names not necessarily escape you, but maybe players that you've not thought about for a while, whether it's from 1910 or from 1920. Here, some names who played a role in this game, from Jack McDowell starting, Bobby Thigpen having his 57th save, and Lance Johnson collecting 3 hits and one of the runs in this game. But these were the bookends. And in between, I came up with a list of games that, well, what might we include? Well, I guess in some way, when we talk about any of the ballparks, you could almost write a history of a ballpark focusing on one player. Maybe, let's say, Ebbetsfield, and focusing on Jackie Robinson in the 1950s, or a handful of players. But I think for us, one of my goals was, what could we do in order to, let's say, focus on as many possible players as we can in order to give an idea. Well, in that last story, we have a lot about Nancy Faust, the organist. If you went to the park, you probably remember Nancy Faust. And here an image from the last game. And her role, I think, without Nancy Faust, you're not going to have Harry Carey doing the 7th inning stretch and singing the way. I mean, I think the U.S. associates Harry Carey and the Chicago Cubs and Take Me Out to the Ballpark, but that's really a White Sox thing and a Comiskey Park notion. And I often ask, other fans or people have asked me and other contributors to the book, do you think there was a signature game at Comiskey Park? Any of you think there was a signature game? Park was around 80 years.
I always think of the first All-Star game. That's what always jumps at me.
Anything else?
I was there for Jack Morris's no-hitter in '84.
So the signature game of 80-year history of the park is a opponent's no-hitter. Well, for me, quite honestly, to be blunt, as much as I love Comiskey Park, 80 years, quite honestly, I don't think there are a lot of signature games at Comiskey Park. Maybe it's because the lack of World Series. Maybe it's because periods of relative unimportance compared to other teams. Very often, this is the game that I hear. The most important game ever at Comiskey Park. Disco demolition. We have a very interesting story about disco demolition, how it happened, why it happened, the role Steve Dahl played. If you're a Chicago native, you know him as a disc jockey being fired in Christmas of 1978 when his station became a disco station, and what he did at the park in between the doubleheader versus Detroit, where he blew up the records. That's typically the game I often hear. And like you mentioned, Bill, I often hear about the 1933 All-Star Game as one of the most important games in Comiskey. Well, that game itself was interesting. It was the World's Fair, and Arch Ward, as all of you know, played the role, a very important role in developing that game. But a lot of the festivities that were to begin happening with the All-Star Game, some had their genesis with this first game, others developed. I think an important aspect is that sports writers chose who played in that game. And of course, later that summer, we have the first Negro League All-Star Game also at Comiskey in September. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And so we have around 80 games in between this first and last game that we created. I often think, well, who are the best pitchers who pitched the majority of their career in Comiskey? We mentioned Ed Walsh. Typically, we see these three, maybe Teddy Lyons, Red Faber, Billy Pierce as among the three best pitchers, if not the best pitchers. But none of them threw a no-hitter at Comiskey. Well, Eddie Walsh threw the first no-hitter. Can anyone, a little trivia question, anyone know who else threw a no-hitter at Comiskey? A White Sox pitcher?
Seacott?
Who's that?
Eddie Seacott?
Nope, not at Comiskey.
Bob Keegan did. I was there.
Keegan did? Yeah.
Hoyt? Maybe?
Well, we'll take a look at them. I think it's interesting. I wanted to say a few things about no-hitters. There were six. Go Horland threw one in 67. Yeah, there were 6 Chicago no-hitters thrown. And what's interesting is when we think of no-hitters, especially prior to the last few years and the no-hitter month of May in Major League Baseball, these are not the great pitchers in Chicago history who have thrown them. The second one, after Eddie Walsh, who threw his in 1911, Joe Benz threw one, an interesting spitballer. He won around 79 games in his career, played around 9 years, was on the 1917 team, but not a player who evokes any memories of great White Sox pitchers. Another one, Vern Kennedy, in his first full season in 1935, an interesting character. In 1935, who threw his no-hitter, and really maybe the idea of a budding star was Vern Kennedy, and he won 20 games his next season, but he ended his career with around a 104, 132 record. So someone who pitched, was injured shortly after his career began with the White Sox and pitched no-hitter. Another one, someone I guess most avid baseball fans don't remember, Bill Dietrich, nicknamed the Bullfrog. He threw one. He was also around 30 games under 500 in his career. Threw one in 1937, late in his career, and resuscitated his career. Pitched almost 20 years in the majors. The other two, as you said, Don, you were there, maybe hanging out, having a beer with Bob Keegan's family. 1957, another person thought would be a star. He was an all-star in 57. When he all-star in 1954, when he threw his no-hitter in 1957, he only won one more game. His next start, he threw a 3-hitter, and that was his last win as a starter. He pitched in relief late that season, picked up a win, but he only won 40 games in his career before his arm blew out. And the last no-hitter by a Chicago White Sox pitcher was in 1967, at a really important time for the White Sox. If you're a White Sox fan, you might remember there was a 4-way tie for first place right around this time as September broke, with Detroit, Chicago, Boston, and Minnesota, all within a few games of one another. At the end of the first week of September, when Joe Horland threw his no-hitter. I think another figure that we kind of overlook is his importance. He through in a 5-year period from 1964 to 1968, he actually led all American League pitchers in earned run average, about a 230 earned run average. He's also, maybe we could debate this on a Saber Facebook page, is what pitcher has a losing record? Which pitcher with a losing record might be considered the best pitcher in Major League history? Well, maybe Horland could be considered among those. He was exactly 113 and 113 with the White Sox, lost a few games with the A's in the early 70s and finished with a sub 500 record. But I figure another game that I often hear is, what is the signature game or maybe the most well-known game at Comiskey? Some have emailed me and said, well, it's Bob Feller's opening day no-hitter in 1940. That was the first of his 27 wins that season. Another one that I often hear is maybe one of the oddest games. There were altogether 9 no-hitters, as I mentioned, at Comiskey. Those 6 by White Sox pitchers, and there were 3 by non-White Sox pitchers. This one by Bob Feller. You all mentioned Jack Morris in 1990, maybe one of Bill Nolan's best favorite players. Bill Monboquette threw one in 1962, Monbos, and one that was considered a no-hitter before the Statistical Accuracy Committee convened in 1991. It was considered a no-hitter when it was thrown, was Andy Hawkins' very bizarre no-hitter. And I think somebody mentioned they are on the Halsey Hall chapter in Minnesota. I believe Stu Thornley wrote and contributed the essay on Andy Hawkins' no-hitter. This one, did anyone attend? Anyone today in the group attend this game? I think it's one of the most interesting and bizarre of all the no-hitters. Obviously, it's not considered a no-hitter now. But Andy Hawkins, in the 8th inning, in the bottom of the 8th, gave up 4 unearned runs on 3 errors and 2 walks, lost the game 4-0 in a very strange game. I happen to actually see that one on TV. But those are, for me, interesting no-hitters that went on. We've included all of the World Series games in the book. The World Series, obviously, from 1917, and the World Series games from 1919. All of the games, as you all know, a good number of you contributed to the book. All of the games follow the Games Project format. And those of you who are not involved in the Games Project format, Games Project from Saber, I recommend that you consider doing it. It's a really great way to get involved with some of the research that Saber specifically publishes. And when I think back to the 1917 World Series, was there a signature game in the 1917 World Series? I don't know if there is a signature game. If so, I would say it's the game 1. Eddie Cicotti tosses complete game and wins 2-1 over Slim Sally. I think I love these uniforms that were shown in the previous image, and here Eddie with his manager Pants Roland. But when I think back to the history of the World Series, if any of you who research that and what are signature moments in World history and in World Series history, I don't know if there's one really in the 1917 World Series other than perhaps this game 1. We might think of the 1917 World Series.
Greg, the signature game of the 1917 World Series didn't take place in Chicago. It took place Game 6 at New York when Heine Zimmerman chased Eddie Collins across an unguarded home plate. That's what it's known for.
Yeah, well, I'm talking about in Comiskey Park. You know, what are these signature games in Comiskey Park over in an 80-year history? I think of maybe we could take a look at some of Red Faber's heroics with his 3 wins in the World Series. We have games 1, 2, and 5 take place, and game 6, the clincher in New York, as we've mentioned. 3 of the games were there. I pull up this image here. This image is from the Chicago American. I believe, from September of 1909, from September 1909, an image of how the park looked. I pulled this up in part because when we think of, well, the 1918 World Series, obviously the 1918 World Series featured the Chicago Cubs. Now, all of us are baseball fans. In many ways, what we're doing is preaching to the choir here. But how do we talk about baseball history to people who are interested and might not know a lot about baseball history? I mean, for me as a baseball writer and a researcher, I think that one problem that Saber sometimes has is that, one, we get bogged down in factoids. And when we get bogged down in factoids, we might lose the overarching narrative of history, what makes baseball history exciting to, let's say, a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old who doesn't have that, let's say, knowledge of factoids that can just be reeled out. Well, how might baseball capture a narrative of a time? So when I take a look at Comiskey here or Comiskey here, and I think of the architect, Zachary Taylor Davis, and all of you, of course, know that he designed both Comiskey and Wrigley. For those of you who are Chicagoans, he also designed Mount Carmel High School. My daughter goes to a Catholic school here on the north side. So we're down there playing sports at Carmel. If maybe some of you even went to Carmel. But Zachary Taylor Davis, by the way, did his internship and worked under Louis Sullivan in Chicago, if you're interested in Chicago architectural history, the father of the modern skyscraper and of modernism. So if we take a look at this image, these two images of Comiskey, and then maybe we take a look at this here, what became here, Weigman Park, what became Wrigley Field, well, we can see how, well, I hate to use the word, how rinky-dink Wrigley Field was, or Weigman Park was, in 1915. It seated around 15,000 for almost the first decade of its existence. And if we think of demographic shifts in Chicago, how relatively sparsely populated the north side of Chicago was, even in 1915. If we take a look at the expansion, that was already far from downtown. In 1915, Comiskey Park was twice the size. And in the 1918 World Series, of course, when the Cubs played there, the idea was that there would be a better attendance. Well, game one of the 1918 World Series only had 19,000. And the Cubs lost that first game in somewhat of a, it was surprising how the attendance was much lower. It was anticipated to be a sellout despite World War I going on. It might be the signature game of the 1918 World Series, at least an interesting one from a historical perspective. Babe Ruth tossing a 6-hitter and winning. He also won game 4 in Boston. Interestingly enough, despite leading the American League in home runs that season, Babe Ruth only appeared in those 2 games, plus very briefly in another game, but did not have an at-bat. So despite his offensive prowess, only had those 2 games. I find that to be an interesting point about the World Series. The attendance did go up in the subsequent games in Chicago for the World Series. We've tried to focus on different aspects of history at Comiskey. One of the eras that we took a look at, obviously with the 1950s and 1960s. Well, one thing we wanted to take a look at was the 1950 Go-Go Sox, thinking about the passcode here. An interesting image of Bill Veeck and El Lopez, who I'm sure had nightmares of the Yankees his entire life, at least after the 1950s, finishing in second place with the Indians or the White Sox 6 times, I believe, or maybe 7 times. Here, the 1959 World Series. I really love this image of Comiskey Park, looking north on Chicago. I think every time that I take a quick look at this, it's somewhat disorienting because you don't have the interstate here on the east side. And a quick glance, you might even think that you're looking south and mistake the railroad tracks for maybe the Orion until you see the city in smog and how the park is situated. Another image I just wanted to show of Comiskey that I also find very interesting, looking south here from the railroad tracks at the park. Anyway, the 1959 World Series Game 1. Anyone attend Game 1 of the World Series in Chicago or any Chicago 59 World Series games? Don, did you attend any? Not so much. Well, that Game 1 that we have included, we've included all of the games. That first game is the Ted Kluszewski game that he hit 2 home runs. He only hit 2 home runs all season after he was acquired in a midseason trade. Had been suffering for about 3 years already with bad back problems. Probably weighed at that point in his career close to 300 pounds. But turned out a big World Series game here early, win Major League Cy Young Award winner for the White Sox in 59. In addition to the games like the no-hitters or the World Series games, we've also included the 83 ALCS games. Those games 3 and 4, if you're a White Sox fan, you might want to forget those games. Those were, of course, big losses for the White Sox, 11-1 and 3-0. But we've included a lot of games which we might just put under the idea of great games, milestone games, oddities in baseball history to give fans and people who don't know necessarily about baseball history. And I think one of the great things about the Saber books that we have, these books are written for casual fans, but those who want to learn more about sports. We've included the only cycle by a White Sox player in Comiskey Park, which is hard to believe. Not to mention it was accomplished by a player from whom you do not expect a cycle, namely Fisk, whose triple, it was his 4th hit, I believe, finished the cycle. We have the longest game in American League and National League history, lasted 25 innings. Harold Baines had the game-winning home run, a walk-off home run in the 25th inning, and Tom Seaver. And I think I might have seen one of you wearing one of these old school White Sox caps. Tom Seaver picked up the win in relief. We have other games that might be historical as well as interesting. The first night opener in Chicago White Sox history, Comiskey, Wilbur Wood tossing a 3-hitter in 72, as well as a game ending the 1971 season when Bill Melton hit a home run. He, Norm Cash, and Reggie Jackson were all tied with 32 home runs the final day of the season, and he hit his 33rd home run in 71. The previous year, in 1970, he was the first one to hit 30 home runs in White Sox history. So some interesting games if we think of the role, not to mention 2 really beautiful uniforms here. We've tried to include games from baseball players who might be completely forgotten. One, Jerry Nyman tosses a 4-hit shutout in his first start. And in August of 1968, the White Sox at this point had completely bottomed out after 17 consecutive seasons of winning records. They finished in 8th place, just a game from having the worst record in the American League. Nyman only won 6 games in his career, blew his arm out. Or a game like this, when we think of home runs and power hitters in Comiskey Park history, we just mentioned someone like Bill Melton leading the league in 1933 in home runs before he developed really serious back issues. But Merv Connors, a name that most people, I would argue, wouldn't remember, even the most ardent White Sox fans. He was the first White Sox player to hit 3 home runs in a game. Did that in 1938. He had 2 cups of coffee with the White Sox in September of 37, again in September of 38. hits 3 home runs in 1938 and has that slash line that I've given. And he was never invited back. He never made the team again. He never made the majors again. But he turned into somewhat of a minor league home run legend. Hit about 400 home runs in his minor league career, had a long minor league career. And we've also included several feature essays in this book. One of those discusses Negro League games at Comiskey, both the Negro League All-Star games from 1933 to 1960, as well as Negro League history, World Series games. And then we focused on about 10 Negro League games in general at the park. So that's really all I have to say of some of the things that we've tried to do with our book. And I'll say in general, a good number of you have contributed to the Saber books already. And I hope you contribute to other books that Saber is publishing.
Great. Well, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I didn't see any questions in the chat, but we'll definitely open it up. So unmute yourself and ask. But before we do that, I did want to ask a question in terms of putting together a book like this about a ballpark. What's the process like for you as an editor, really down to the individual authors? You mentioned it could be 2 years start to finish. Can you just kind of generally walk through what that process is?
Well, now, when if one is interested in leading a book for Saber as the lead editor, you'll need to write a proposal and have that submitted to a committee that will be vetted. And let's say if your proposal has been accepted, then I'll start from right there. Well, part of it is, well, how do you put together, just like any of you, many of you have published books through different companies and publishers. Well, you put together a proposal. However, the vision, what is going to be the length of the book in anticipation of what can you have included. Let's say we've decided upon a series of 10 feature essays and a series of 80 or 100 games. The book on Shy Park that is finished, we have 100 games in Shy Park and let's say 10 essays, so a little bit longer than the Comiskey Park book. One is I simply took months of figuring out what games do we want to have. I mean, as I mentioned, you could easily say, well, I want 10 games by Red Faber. Why I like Joe Horn, I'll throw in a bunch of games that he did. I really like Richie Allen, I'll throw in a bunch of games here. But I think with the idea, how do you, what is the overall vision that you want the games to do? So once you figure that out, and secure those games through the Games Project to have those reserved for us. Then we start the process. I mean, we had a general call for authors through various Saber sources, sometimes through Saber NL, sometimes through various Saber committees. Authors submitted, let's say, 1 to 2, 3, 4 essays. All of those go through rigorous editing, just like anything for the BioProject. That means initial submission, vetting, second reader. Bill Nolan was the second reader, fact checking and copy editing. That means that each essay went through at least 5 different iterations before it had its final version. I mean, that's the way it is in the BioProject too. Every essay goes through that kind of project. Then we have to procure images. Those cost Saber money. So if we don't get them free from a source, sometimes teams have given us images. Sometimes Bill made contacts through Tops that got us images before, but we also have to buy images, maybe from the Hall of Fame, maybe from a different source. And so that's how the process. And so for me, it's continually working with authors, sometimes helping authors write, sometimes helping authors tell their story. So a lot of it is how can we flesh out the idea. If any of you have written for Saber, you know the process that you have when you submit to the Games Project or the BioProject, how it's in many ways the final written version can be substantially different than your first submission to Saber, as you know.
Yeah, because I think it's interesting, and I know, Brian, you have a question. I'll let you go next. But the one thing when you're adhering to the games project guidelines, it becomes the challenge of what's an interesting aspect of that game, and what do you include and what do you have to admit, sometimes against your like really good feeling it's a good story. Because when I was writing about the game 2 of the 1918 World Series, I found this little nugget in, I forget which of the local papers, but it talked about 3 young boys who pooled their money to go to the Cubs office. They bought 1 ticket for each of the 3 games at Comiskey Park. And the one kid on his way home lost them, just fell out of his pocket. And the dad called the White Sox or the Cubs and just said, what can I do? What can I do? And they said, don't worry, make sure, because each one of the boys went to one of the games and there was a security guard waiting and he had to show, some form of ID. And they're like, we'll go in there. And there happened to be a guy sitting in that seat for the first game there. And they're like, sir, you need to move. So it was just this great little local nugget that it just didn't fit. And it kind of kills me that I wasn't able to do anything with it. But that's just one of the challenges. So.
Well, you have to work within a limit. I would say, doing so much editing like this and for the Bio Project, on one hand, what I like most is helping an author tell the story. What I dislike the most is when authors have a problem taking feedback. Now, right. I write academically outside of what I do for Saber. And if you want to see people give you a shit pie and tell you to eat it, well, I can show you what I receive from people who read my documents that I might write academically and say, this is X, Y, and Z, change it, it's terrible, right? And we work to help authors flesh out the story. And granted, you have to work within a parameter. A lot of people in the Bio Project were really pushing that people write within the limit that we have. If we can tell a story in an X amount of time, then we're trying to. So limits are there for a reason. These aren't pet projects, right? This isn't vanity publishing.
Absolutely. So Brian, it looks like you had a question you mentioned in the chat. So.
Yeah. First off, I want to thank the Saber as always for the work you guys have been doing for a long time has been extraordinary, and it just needs to be said. Especially want to thank Smiley, Fletcher, and Rich Hansen for their longtime friendship over many years. Dr. Wolf, I want to thank you for teaching my daughter Genevieve at North Central.
Yes, indeed,
she spoke very highly of you. Some of you may know I've been a longtime Wrigley Field historian. I do have a World Series ring, which is a lot of fun to have, and I'm very thankful for my longtime association with baseball research, especially with Pitch and Hit and Dr. Fletcher and others. I'm a researcher who's hit a roadblock, and that's what I want to talk to you about, Greg, and see what your thoughts are. You had a great little snippet of a architectural rendering of the ballpark from 1909 from the Chicago American. I'm wondering a couple quick things. One, what are your thoughts about really what's accessible from papers that are no longer in existence? For example, the Chicago Tribune and only a few other of the about 18 different papers that were around during that time period. Only a couple have really dedicated themselves to being online. Otherwise, you're really dedicated to either looking at microfiche, if that even exists anymore. So as a baseball historian, I'm deeply concerned about the lack of access to things like the Herald Examiner, the Chicago American, and others. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. The second is along those lines, and it's a very specific question, but hopefully it would open up, especially for guys like Rich Hansen and others who have always had a long interest in ballparks. Zachary Taylor Davis's work, as you defined, is pretty extraordinary. He also did the Chicago. He did a lot of different buildings aside from what was cited, but a lot of his work was not only under Louis Sullivan, but it was also under Osborne Engineering. And I'm wondering where you find archival stuff pre-1910. There's one of the interesting roadblocks I found when I started doing my work on Wrigley was that building permits were not often taken by the Chicago Cubs to do their work. They did their work as of right. And when I went through various governmental sources and then private sources, they just weren't pulling permits. And I'm particularly interested in a period when both Comiskey Park and Wrigley double-decked almost at the same time. So there's really two questions in there. Pre-1910 Osborne, what would you suggest this young kid from the Southwest side who is actually a Cub fan to go track and how to track? But more importantly, what kind of other resources would you look at from those of us that are particularly interested in stadia as backups to old engineering companies like Osborne, which no longer exists, and others to kind of track down some of the information necessary? Thank you. And Genevieve, by the way, says hello.
I remember when she showed me your World Series ring, probably in class one day. She was so excited about it. Well, I think for the first question for me is, quite honestly, I still use a lot of microfiche. I mean, I can't limit my research to just newspapers that are online or what we have access to. And I still place through our library countless requests for microfiche and microfilm via interlibrary loan, and get a lot. No, that's not. Not everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Now we can. Yeah.
Okay.
It broke up for a
what's
second.
going on? Maybe there was something behind. I still have access to the microfilm and microfiche. So that's one thing that I would say. It could be that you have local chapter libraries in Chicago that you're able to request microfilm for no charge. Okay, I would look into it. I don't know. I can't recall. I used to use the Lincoln Square branch of the library that I was able to get microfilm and microfiche
Harold
free.
Washington's good for that.
Okay, that I was able to get it for free and through a bunch of libraries, not just those that were in the iShare Illinois library system, but also outside of the iShare system. So that's what I would say. Maybe some others have better suggestions.
What about and this last question, because I know there's a lot of people who will have them, but the last question is relative to, have you ever gone digging deeper into the proprietary archives? For example, there's two companies that I'm constantly looking for what happened to their archive. Actually, three. One is Kaufman and Fabry, who did all the panoramas. I wonder what the heck happened to all those, because a lot of them didn't end up at the Library of Congress. A lot of them have ended up scattered in different genre holders. Two is clearly Osborne Engineering and their work on all the classic ballparks. And then finally, the archive of the Wrigley family itself. I've actually given speeches on Wrigley Field at Catalina Island, and on a couple different occasions. And I've flown to Catalina just to look at what Wrigley family holdings are there, and they're really, really stingy about it. So I'm wondering what you've bumped up into relative to whether it was the Comiskeys or the Art Laren archives or any of those things.
Well, with regard to engineering and ballparks, I have a colleague who teaches at Penn State who specializes in engineering and sports stadiums. His name is Bob Trumpor. If you shoot me an email,
by the way, I know where you teach. I can find you.
Or just through my North Central account.
Yeah.
Shoot me an email, and I will send you his name and put you in contact with him.
Greg, I'm very.
That's his specialization.
That's
exactly. He contributed before to some of the books that I did specifically about that. That's about all I could really suggest.
Greg, I appreciate you. I appreciate your work, and my daughter's using that sports management and psychology degree to her best aspects. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Richard Smiley, you have a question. You have an answer.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not muted. Yeah, mine was a little more direct, Greg. I think you can provide an answer to this because it's just personal opinion. In the process of putting together the Comiskey book, like, what was your biggest surprise, or what was the thing that, like, you came out of this, like, delighted you, or like, oh, I didn't know that. What did you learn from?
I really appreciate that question, Richard. I really do. I think part of it is putting together a list of 100 games or 85 games. Once you exclude the games you think should belong there, like the no-brainers, 3 All-Star games and World Series games and something, then what do you do with the rest of the games? How do you find another 70 games? What is important? And it can't just be, someone struck out 16 batters or somebody hit 3 home runs. How are the games significant within a time? How do they capture this zeitgeist? How do they capture an era? And so I think 2 of the things that were, I think for me, interesting, I think in general, the first is just learning about players about whom I knew only superficial information or nothing at all. I'm 54 years old. I didn't see Jerry Nyman. I don't know if I even heard of Jerry Nyman before I started this. And I tell you what, like all of you, I know pretty much about baseball, but I don't know if I had ever heard about him. And so the more you're talking about what are something like that, or something like Merv Connors, I really enjoyed learning about that. So for me, what I like in general about working with Rory Costello as co-directors of the BioProject is simply learning in a much deeper way about individuals, the individual story, and the narrative of a game. And these games are not just a rehashing of statistics, but really an attempt to situate these games historically. So for me, Richard, what I would say is learning about players that time has forgotten. Merv Connors. I mean, let's go to a White Sox game and ask everyone there who's heard of Merv Connors.
Yeah. Till a week ago, I hadn't heard his name, and then this is the second time within a week I've heard that same thing. I didn't know who he was until a week ago.
And I think maybe just the breadth of what was going on at the ballpark.
Any other questions? I didn't see anything else in the chat. So
yeah, I had a comment about Brian and Greg's discussion about newspapers, Chicago newspapers on microfilm. For my book on the 1920 White Sox, I actually came to Chicago for a week, and I spent a little bit of time at the public library downtown. But I did most of my work at the Chicago History Museum, and I used the Chicago American, Chicago Herald and Examiner, Chicago Evening Post primarily as newspapers that aren't available digitally. And I was astonished at the bad condition of this microfilm. It's particularly at the library downtown, and the machines that they have there are wretched. At least at the Chicago History Museum, they have good machines to use them. But
yeah,
I mean, some of the pages of the paper were almost unreadable. And it's such a shame. And really, history is being lost that way.
Yeah, I'll just second what Don has to say, because especially by the Washington, I've used that a lot. And like you said, the machines go, and then, once a machine goes, you won't see it repaired for months at a time. And so, superficially, it looks like, oh, there's 20 machines here, when actually you have to dig through and find the 1 or 2 that are actually working, sort of, to look at something. So I'll second that.
And Bruce said that the term wretched is charitable to describe that. So
it's becoming a real challenge, and also the newsletters are becoming hard to find as well. Wrigley Field, the Cubs did a newsletter for decades, and now that they've gotten out of the Vine Line business and everything else, that's going to create a problem for future historians because the internet cache is not going to be what it needs to be. And then when you start looking at definitely the haphazard, I would, two quick arguments. One is that there, for every one book about the White Sox, there's at least 15 to 20 about the Cubs. So I think White Sox historians are going to have problems there. Two, the access to archival information from the Sox itself is becoming suspect, just because those collectors aren't even putting it out in the field. And the third thing, and you can look at eBay to find this out, I tend to own a lot of source material. I own the entire 1914 and 1915 in both in print and in microfiche of the Chicago Tribune and the Daily News, because I wanted to make sure I was tracking how the construction of the ballpark went. So I own actually the microfilm and the actual flats. The problem that we're finding now is not only is that stuff degenerating, but there are certain documents, I would say, and check eBay for it, that you will find that there's no way a private collector really should have. These should belong to the ballparks or the organizations or some other, to Doc Fletcher's Baseball Museum, if it ever, and I would hope it gets built. Those are documents that belong, but I'm finding construction documents relating to Charles Comiskey building the first scoreboard at Comiskey on auction pages. And I found that during my lifelong work on Wiegman, the Federal League, and Wrigley. It's just a lot of stuff was stolen. And the problem that I think that was mentioned by the other speaker, not named Smiley or Bernardoni, is that as that stuff degenerates, I think we're really walking into a dangerous, Don Zminda brought it up, that we're walking really into a really dangerous time for baseball archivists, because there's just no real good way for us to find it. And the machines in most of the public facilities suck, and the record keeping sucks in a lot of those places. We're really walking into a dangerous period, which is why David Fletcher should take all the money that he's made in being a surgeon and a doctor, and he should just give it all up and make a museum and make us all happy, and so we can store our crap there. Thank you very much.
No pressure, right? Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Don. Don, you edited the 59 White Sox book, one of the earlier books in Saber's endeavors in that area. How has the process evolved, I guess, from writing that to the work Greg is doing now?
Oh, it's about a million times better now. When I did the book, this was when John Zeitz was president of Saber, and Saber was not publishing these books. So I had to find a publisher for this book. Fortunately, the publisher that did John DeWan's books got interested in it, so they published it. But a lot of that work, to be honest, I financed it myself, like getting pictures from the White Sox, getting pictures from the Hall of Fame, and it was a ton of work. Not that the work is a whole lot easier now, but the process is much more streamlined than it was then. We actually redid the 59 White Sox book as a Saber book, and working with Bill Nowlin. And that whole process was much more streamlined. It's much easier to do a book like that now. And I'm so grateful to Saber for taking an interest in books like this, because it's a great operation.
Thanks.
Great.
I have a general question, maybe for everyone, and maybe answers to Bill at some point, Bill Perch. That is, with all of the research that Saber conducts and publishes, not just the books, but the Bio Project and the Games Project, I often wonder, how can we advocate and publicize this research better and more effectively? And not just in a venue where we're speaking to other Saber members, all of whom might have heard of the work, but how can we get to a wider audience? That's always a question. Now, for the White Sox book, what I did mention, I probably told Brian at some point, with the White Sox, I happen to be teaching a course at North Central on baseball and American society. And 2 or 3 of my students contributed an essay to that White Sox, to the Comiskey Park book. And so I might have an audience there talking about Saber, but how can we, as members of Saber, also help advocate the work that Saber does more effectively?
Yeah, and that's obviously a great challenge, because when you look at a book like this, I mean, we're just specifically talking about one, the amount of time and effort that goes into this research and proofing and writing and the whole process of design, that we're really trying to get that out to a much wider audience. And that's one of the opportunities. It's fairly easy to, pitch baseball books to other baseball people. We're naturally going to talk about it. But if you have those connections to other entities, maybe a museum where it might be time specific, with a particular era or a ballpark or a player from a different time, or if there's a topic maybe related to social justice and there's a museum, or a writer or somebody like that speaks about that on a regular basis, we'd love to know that, make those connections. So, to kind of jump onto that point, if there are any connections you might have, we're more than happy to reach out to me, let me know. And I just saw the comment in there that, yes, I'm actually the chair of Saber's marketing committee. And that is really our, publicizing the books is really, the publications is really our number one task right now. So
Bill, reach out to me. I do a lot of work with WGN and a lot of the other publications. It's really strange, Greg, that you would say that, because I look at it almost in the other way. There are so many avenues open for folks to actually do what we're trying to do, because so many of the reporters, at least in this town in Chicago, are baseball fans. And there's a lot of, and a lot of the prominent writers that are on social media right now, like the Bill Savages of the world and stuff like that. I mean, they love cranking this stuff out. And the strange thing I found, and Doc Fletcher, I think, will appreciate this, I've really enjoyed in my time doing baseball research, finding that there are small museums that I never even knew existed that are looking and craving people to come out, whether it's the folks at Catalina Island or the Shoeless Joe Museum in Greenville, South Carolina, or even the Museum of Baseball Stadiums in Denver, Colorado. It's just a matter, I think, for Saber to start aggregating those resources and repositioning them a little bit. A lot of them are starting to dip their toe, and aggressively, I would think, in social media and things like that. And I also think there are some vested families that are interested in it. I know the Ricketts are interested in it, but I also know that Night Train Vec is very interested in perpetuating that. And Dr. Fletcher knows the Vec family very well. I mean, there's a lot of folks that I think are interested. I think, Bill, you've done a great service just by putting out there and asking the question, how do we do it? And I think from a lot of us former Saber people and current Saber people, I think we're ready to jump on that, especially as Saber goes into that. And Saber's doing an excellent job in the social media end. I think you guys are kicking ass in the publication end. The publications you guys are doing are really sublime. And I think, if anything, to Don's point, they're really trying to preserve what's left of baseball history.
Hey, Bill, this is Dennis. Can I quickly jump in there?
Yeah, please do.
A lot of these museums are looking for income. If we could find a way to get our books, so use the Negro League Museum, and we've got a number of these publications that would be Negro League related, sell the books through there, and then they earn the proceeds. It's a source of income, and people going to their websites or visiting are interested in baseball, and that's one of the ways to do that. I think I saw Dixie was on this. I had his play ball calendar forever and ever and ever. And that's how I learned about Saber, was by having that magazine, that calendar every year. And eventually I told my wife, hey, go and buy me this membership for Christmas. So it took years of trying to pound Saber into my head before I joined, but can we go out there and do that? The other question I have for Gregory is, why do we use the format for our books, the bigger size rather than a normal book size? Would it be easier to work with book chains to sell a book that was a normal book size rather than I call it table size?
Bill Nolan, Bill, can you answer that? My assumption is because of the printing of the books. But Bill, what do you say?
It's partly because we have so much that we want to say. If you think about the size of the books, if they're already 350 pages and you shrink it down to a 5:9 format, it starts getting to be 450 or 500 pages.
Details like printing and stuff. Yeah, I figured of something like that. It just, but I know we can work with museums and mentioned there, Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum. All these smaller baseball museums are always trying to find a buck. But how can we work with them to have things in there? The Comiskey Park, there's White Sox fans because of Shoeless Joe who may visit that site or something and see the book. And we could share the proceeds with them. There's all kinds of these out there.
Actually, one thing, you mentioned the Negro League Museum in Kansas City. I don't have the dates in front of me, but we've had several publications recently related to the Negro Leagues. If you are familiar with their online book discussions, several of those are going to be part of that rotation.
Good.
So I'm more than happy to, after this meeting, get that information out to you, because I think we have some rough dates. There might be a little shuffling around that we need to do with the particular publication, but that's a big deal for us to have that audience really sharing what we're doing.
Within the first 10 days of June, there's an event that the Negro Leagues Museum is going to be featuring one of our Saber books.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions? If not, I have one last comment on Comiskey Park. My mom said it's not a game, but the signature moment at Comiskey Park was the afternoon Beatles concert that she and my aunt attended together and possibly got lost on the way and swore never to tell your dad what happened. So 1965. So perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll kick it over to Don. So you should be co-host. You should be able to share your screen, but I have a quick little intro for you. So Don's been a Saber member since 1979. He retired in 2016 after 2+ decades with Stats LLC, where he served first as director of publications and then director of research for Stats, supported sports broadcasts that included the World Series, Super Bowl, the NCAA Final Four. Don has also written or edited more than a dozen sports books, including the legendary Harry Carey, Baseball's Greatest Salesman, and that was a Casey Award nominee. And we talked about it, the Saber publication Go Go to Glory, the 1959 Chicago White Sox. He's a Chicago native, but he now lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Sharon. And the book that he's talking about is his new book, Double Plays and Double Crosses, the Black Sox and Baseball in 1920. So Don, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. This book has been out since March, and it's been pretty well received. So I'm grateful for that. There is a lot of detail in the book and a lot of material it covers. So instead of doing a presentation on the whole book, I wanted to concentrate on one aspect of the story that is covered in the first few chapters of the book, and then again in the epilogue. And that is Charles Comiskey's decision to bring back the 8 players ultimately known as the Black Sox for the 1920 season. And it was a very fateful decision, both for the players and for Comiskey. And it really colored the whole history of the White Sox and really the rest of Charles Comiskey's life as well. So that will be the subject of this presentation. I thought it might be easier if we held off questions and comments until I got through the presentation. But feel free to make comments and ask questions when I'm finished. And also feel free to ask questions through the chat as well. So here goes. Charles Comiskey, at the time of the White Sox winning the World Series in 1917, was one of the most prosperous, successful, and popular owners in baseball. The White Sox, I think, probably along with the Red Sox, were the to prestige teams in the American League. And in terms of attendance, really the White Sox were the most prosperous team in the American League. And Comiskey himself, building his own ballpark in 1910, building a very successful and competitive team, he was extremely popular. And really, probably the high point of his career as an owner came after the White Sox won the World Series in 1917 over the New York Giants, who were really the dominant team in the National League. And there was an article in Baseball Magazine that came out after this 1917 World Series that was written by American League umpire Billy Evans, just lauding Comiskey and praising him for his operation. And he talks about how Comiskey is the most popular of magnates. He has the following on the south side of Chicago that supports the White Sox no matter what position the club happens to be in. And in reality, the fans follow Comiskey more than the team. Well, I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it does point up, what a popular owner he was. He really was very well regarded and really revered, both among other owners and among the fans as well. So through those first 17 years of the White Sox, they're really a great team. They had the second best overall winning percentage in the American League next to the Red Sox, and it was really pretty close. They won 3 American League championships, including the first one in 1901. And then they won the World Series in 1906 and 1917. In 1906, they defeated the mighty Cubs team that had won 116 games, still a record or tied for the record for most wins in a full season. And when either the Cubs or the White Sox were in the World Series, they used to play the annual City Series in Chicago. The White Sox had a 6-2 advantage in that City Series over the Cubs through 1917. And they had won 6 series in a row from 1911 to 1916. And as I mentioned, their total attendance was really good, second to the Giants, and again, a really successful and prosperous team. So then comes the next 2 seasons, and this is when really things started to change. And it really began with the 1918 season. That was a season that was shortened due to World War I. It was a very uncertain season in baseball, and the White Sox really didn't go through the season very well at all. They went from winning the World Series to finishing in 6th place. Their attendance was the worst in franchise history, and it was a catastrophic drop of almost 500,000 fans from the 1917 season. And one thing that happened in the 1918 season was that the federal government issued what was known as the Worker Fight Order. And that was for people who were of military age. They were either expected to join the military or work in a war-related field. And for baseball players to work in a non-military operation was considered very suspect. So what happened with the White Sox was that Joe Jackson, Lefty Williams, Happy Felsch, and a catcher, Bird Lynn, left the team in midseason to either work in the shipyards or do other non-baseball work. These people were criticized endlessly. They were called shipyard slackers. The Chicago Tribune did an editorial about Joe Jackson about how he's big and husky and should be brave enough to fight, and instead he's cowering in a shipyard. It was really, I think, terribly unfair to these players. The Black Sox committee had an article, one of their newsletters a few years ago, about this shipyard work. And they found out that not only was the work very essential and very important to the military, but that the ball players who worked in these shipyards, including Jackson and Williams, did some pretty important work. They did play ball while they were working in the shipyards, but even the ball playing was considered a big morale boost to the other workers in the shipyard. So it really was pretty beneficial work. And the criticism that they received was pretty unfair. But some of the criticism came from Charles Comiskey himself. When these guys left the team, Comiskey was quoted as saying, "I don't want anybody on my team who does that sort of thing and shuns his military duty." And then after the 1918 season, Major League Baseball decided that it was fine for these players to come back to their teams without any repercussions. And then Comiskey changed his mind and had these players back on the team, but he didn't exactly welcome them back. And I think particularly with Jackson, Williams, and Felsch, they felt resentful toward Comiskey. And I think that was part of the background as to why they ended up selling out to gamblers. But that came later. In the 1919 regular season, it was reduced to 140 games because of the uncertainty about how the fans would accept baseball. But the White Sox again had a very successful season. They won the American League pennant, and their winning percentage was actually the second highest percentage in franchise history through the 2020 season. And the payroll of that team was actually the third highest payroll in Major League Baseball. And that's important to note because particularly when the book 8 Men Out came out and then the movie of the same name, Comiskey was criticized for being a cheapskate, for underpaying his players, for being so cheap and miserly that they couldn't be blamed for trying to make a little extra money. That really is a very unfair criticism. The team in 1919 had the third highest payroll in baseball. This despite that very poor season in 1918 and that very low attendance by the White Sox team. Eddie Seacott, the most famous pitcher on the team, at $8,000 actually was the second highest paid American League pitcher behind the great Walter Johnson. Buck Weaver, who complained a lot about his salary, was the second highest paid third baseman behind Home Run Baker. Jackson really was underpaid, but nonetheless, he was the fourth highest paid American League outfielder behind Cobb Speaker, or fifth highest, I should say, behind Cobb Speaker, Rothe, and Harry Hooper. One problem with Jackson was that, to be frank, he was a very bad negotiator. That $6,000 a year contract that he had signed was actually a multi-year contract that he had signed while he was still a member of the Cleveland Indians before he got sold to the White Sox. He seriously undervalued his own potential to earn salary. This was during the time that players like Eddie Collins and Cobb and Speaker and Walter Johnson had all used the leverage of the Federal League to negotiate higher salaries. Eddie Collins, who was sold to the White Sox the same year that Jackson was sold to the White Sox, used the leverage of the Federal League to get a multi-year contract at $15,000 a year. Jackson didn't do that. I think because he was security-minded, and particularly because his wife was very security-minded, he ended up signing a contract with the Indians for something that was seriously below his value. That was unfortunate, but nonetheless, it was a contract that he had asked for. Happy Felsch, Chick Gandil, Swede Brisbane, they really all had salaries that were in line with their pre-1919 accomplishments. I really don't think they had anything to complain about. Lefty Williams, the pitcher, was underpaid. But again, he had left the team for the shipyards in 1918. And in 1919, there were bonuses built into his contract that increased his salary by the end of the season to $3,500, which was more reasonable, although he was still, I think, relatively speaking, underpaid. Overall, Bob Hoey and Michael Hoppert and other people have looked into these salaries that we now have available. these Black Sox players were definitely not underpaid by 1919 MLB standards, but they probably were underpaid relative to their value as entertainers. You have to say that with the reserve clause, all the leverage for ownership over the players existed. So while Comiskey was paying these players relatively well by MLB standards, it doesn't mean that they didn't think that they were underpaid and that there was some justification for them feeling that way. There was a book that came out kind of ironically toward the end of the 1919 season. It was a biography of Comiskey called Kami by a reporter named G.W. Axelson. And one of the quotes in the book was the one that's on this page. He said, Comiskey had less trouble with his players than perhaps any other owner in the game. The player depends on Comiskey for a square deal. And if he delivers, he knows that he is going to get everything that is coming to him. Well, that was probably true, but you have to say Comiskey was the final arbiter of what was fair and what was unfair. And if the players felt resentful, they did have at least some reason to feel that way. So then comes the 1919 World Series. This is not a book about the World Series. I don't go into that in a lot of great detail. But I think we all know the highlights pretty well. The White Sox came in as pretty heavy favorites with good reason, because at that time, the American League was much stronger than the National League. American League was much stronger than the National League. The American League had won 8 of the last 9 World Series. And the one World Series that the National League won in 1914, the Braves over the Athletics, was considered a huge upset. So the White Sox came in as heavy favorites. Before the series starts, there's heavy betting on Cincinnati that suddenly shifts the odds in favor of the Reds. Then they go on to win the World Series 5-3 amid a lot of rumors of foul play. Charles Comiskey and his secretary, Harry Grabner, were actually tipped off by a gambler early in the World Series that there was something going on. They went to John Heidler, who was the president of the National League, and Ban Johnson, who was the president of the American League, and tipped them off about this information. They both kind of blew off. Comiskey and Grabner felt that there was nothing to it. Really, that was really unfortunate, because Comiskey gets painted as the bad guy in this story a lot for not investigating thoroughly enough, for not coming down hard on his players after the World Series was over. But really, it wasn't his job to investigate foul play in baseball. It was really the job of the National Commission, which was a 3-member commission consisting of the American League president, the National League president, and then the 3rd member of the commission was Gary Herman, who happened to be the president of the Cincinnati Reds. So you would think that Gary Herman wasn't going to think that there was foul play that allowed his team to win the World Series. John Heidler was biased in favor of the National League, understandably. So there wasn't a lot of follow-up on their part. Ban Johnson had his own issues. By that time, he was definitely on the outs with Comiskey. The two of them hated each other. But Ban Johnson, as far as investigating the World Series, he had a problem, which was that his ownership and his presidency of the American League was being challenged, not only by Comiskey, but by Harry Frazee, who was the new owner of the Red Sox, and by Colonel Houston and Jacob Rupert, the owners of the New York Yankees. Those 3 really wanted to push Ban Johnson out. And they had a lot of support in Major League Baseball. So Ban Johnson was really more concerned with holding on to his presidency of the American League and holding on to his power in Major League Baseball than he was about investigating the World Series, at least at this particular point. So that was the background. When the World Series ended, the great reporter Hugh Fullerton, who at that point was working in the Chicago area, wrote, "There are 7 men on the team who will not be here when the gong signs next spring, and some of them will not be in either major league." The source of that information, he later reported many years later, was actually Charles Comiskey. So Comiskey at this point, when the World Series ended, was really feeling very strongly that these guys were not going to be back. And when the National Commission showed very little interest in investigating the fix, he announced that he was going to begin his own investigation and offered $10,000 as a reward for information that was useful to finding out the truth of what happened in the World Series. So after he launches the investigation, one of the first people who came forward were there were two Chicago White Sox fans who were had lost money betting on the World Series. One was a guy named Sammy Pass, who was actually close to several of the players. He was very close to Ray Schock. I think he was in Ray Schock's wedding party. He was close to a few other players as well. So he had a lot of credibility among the White Sox. And he and this other fan came to Comiskey and said that he should get in touch with a theater owner and gambler who was in East St. Louis, Illinois, named Harry Redmond. So Comiskey sent the White Sox manager, Kid Gleason, and a team official named Tip O'Neill to East St. Louis to interview Redmond. And Redmond did provide some useful information. There's a quote from Harry Grabner's diary, which was not discovered until the 1960s and was the subject of a chapter in one of Bill Veck's book, The Hustler's Handbook. And there's a quote, which I show on this page, from Grabner's diary, which Grabner had written after they had met with Harry Redmond. He writes, "The players were supposed to have received $15,000 a game from the gamblers. The go-by team from the players was supposed to be Gideon. Joe Gideon was a member of the St. Louis Browns. Bill Burns, who was one of the leading gamblers who arranged the fix, and Abe Attell, a former boxing champion who was also heavily involved in the fix, to handle the betting. The gamblers who paid the fix were Carl Zork, Harry Redmond, Ben Franklin, and 2 Levi brothers from Des Moines. The name of Rothstein was also mentioned. The players on the White Sox mentioned as being Williams, Jackson, Felch, McMillan, Risberg, Gandil, Seacott, and Weaver, the last 2 being crooked in the first game and then turning. Well, not all the information is correct. A lot of it is. Harry Redmond really knew a lot about what was going on in this World Series fix. The unfortunate thing about this information was that Redmond claimed that he wasn't directly involved in the payoff to the players. And in fact, when he was called in front of the Chicago grand jury in October of 1920, he denied any involvement in paying the players. He said the money was never raised. It was dropped right there as soon as I knew anything about it. He suggested that Gleason and Tip O'Neill talked to Carl Zork, one of the gamblers who he said had been in the room with the players where this fix was being discussed. Zork said the same thing as Redmond when he testified in front of the grand jury. He denied any involvement with the scandal. Redmond actually made 2 trips to Chicago in November and December of 1919 and met with Comiskey. Now, according to Comiskey, he could not give us any names, circumstances or facts upon which he could base a charge of crookedness against any ball players engaged in the World Series. Well, this isn't really completely true because he did have a lot of evidence. The main issue is that he had a lot of secondhand evidence. He didn't have a lot of firsthand evidence. And in fact, as I mentioned, Ban Johnson actually talked to Harry Redmond himself. And Ban Johnson, who had everything to gain by getting the goods on Comiskey, he didn't really feel like that what Harry Redmond told him was incriminating enough to follow up at this point. That was a big mistake. Nonetheless, that was what Ban Johnson decided. So another of the aspects of Comiskey's investigation was that he hired a detective firm known as Hunter's Secret Service to actually infiltrate among the ball players who were suspected of the fix, as well as a few of the gamblers. Now, Hunter was not a hack. He was actually a pretty good detective. He had been around the Chicago area for several years. He had an office at, I believe, 10 North LaSalle Street. He had investigated some political shenanigans. He had investigated some bank fraud. He had investigated some pretty high-level divorce cases. And he had a really good reputation. One of the interesting things about him was that in one of the cases of bank fraud that he was involved in, one of the women who was working with him, helping him out as part of the investigation, was a woman named Mabel Reed. And J.R. Hunter ended up marrying her shortly after this investigation completed. And when they investigated Happy Felsch, he sent his wife to Milwaukee, where they were investigating Felsch. And Mabel Hunter befriended Happy Felsch's wife and tried to get information about the fix from her. So they spied on Felsch in Milwaukee. They spied on Gandil, Weaver, and McMillan in Los Angeles. They spied on Swede Risberg indirectly. What they did with Risberg, who was living on the West Coast, was Risberg had a girlfriend and a roommate who he was very close to. And what Hunter's detectives did was they had one of the guys actually befriend the girlfriend of Risberg and her friend. And this guy actually moved into the apartment building where Risberg's girlfriend lived. He became really good friends with them, kept trying to pump them for information about the scandal. While they got a lot of interesting tidbits, all the players involved denied their involvement in the scandal. They never really said anything that was directly incriminating, but they did provide some pretty suspicious information. For instance, when they went to see Happy Felsch, they found that he'd bought a new Hupmobile. When they went to see Chick Gandil, Gandil had just bought a new house in the Los Angeles area. There was a lot of kind of, pretty shady information like that, but there was never anything that was really directly incriminating at that point. So the spying actually continued into the 1920 season. And in fact, the Hunter operative who was spying on Swede Risberg's girlfriend, he actually didn't wrap up his part of the investigation until May of the 1920 season. Again, trying to get information and getting some pretty juicy tidbits, but nothing that would really hold up in a court of law. But part of this investigation is pretty maddening because there were some leads that were followed, not followed, and some pretty suspicious threads as well. One thing that's a little bit curious is that Hunter's operatives, they spied on 5 of the players that were under investigation. They did not spy on Jackson, Williams, or Seacott. Jackson, I think, is a little bit understandable because he was down in Savannah, Georgia. I think sending any northern detective down to Jackson's home turf and trying to get information would have been seen as suspicious. So that would have been pretty difficult to do. Williams was actually working in the same shipyard that he had worked in after the 1918 season. And again, that was probably not a great atmosphere for somebody to infiltrate people that he was working with. So they didn't investigate Williams directly. I am curious about Seacott. Seacott spent the winter in Detroit where he lived. It wouldn't have seemed to be too costly to investigate Seacott. So it's a bit of a puzzle as to why they didn't do that, because they really did a pretty thorough job of trying to infiltrate with the other players. Now, Jackson is an interesting case because he had written to Comiskey in November after the season ended and offered to come to Chicago or any place you may say to clear my name, and whoever started this will have to prove his statements. And Comiskey didn't follow up on that. There's a lot of questions as to why Comiskey did not have Jackson come in. I think at that point, Jackson kept proclaiming his innocence. He was saying that he had nothing to do with the scandal. I think all he would have done if he had come to Chicago would have been to say, I hit 375 in the World Series. I played honestly. I don't know nothing about anything else. Why are you trying to incriminate me? But Comiskey never confronted him directly. Now, later on, Jackson claimed that he tried to alert Comiskey and Grabner of the scandal right after the series. Supposedly, he had this bag full of money, and he came to Comiskey and Grabner and tried to show him the money and tell him what happened, but they blew him off, said, "We don't want to talk to you." Another story that he said was that he actually went to Kid Gleason and Comiskey prior to the World Series even starting and saying, I don't want to play. I don't want anything to do with this World Series. Well, those are great stories, but Joe Jackson never volunteered those stories until several years after the 1919 World Series. Jackson was put on trial along with the other 7 players in 1921. Comiskey and Grabner were on the witness stand during that trial. During the cross-examination, those issues were never brought. Nobody said, Joe tried to tell you about this right after the World Series and you blew them off. That never happened. Jackson really didn't come up with these stories until several years later. And I really don't think they're very credible. I'm just sorry. A lot of people believe them. I just think the timing is too suspicious. Another thing that was a little bit curious was that neither Comiskey nor Hunter attempted to track down Bill Burns or Abe Attell, who were named by Harry Redmond as key members of the fix. And neither Comiskey nor Hunter interviewed or spied on Seacott's landlady, who was a woman named Henrietta Kelly, who supposedly overheard Seacott saying, "The hell with them, I got mine." They never talked to her. Another thing that was curious was that in December of 1919, a gambling publication called Collier's Eye quoted Ray Schock as saying that several members of the team would not be back in 1920. And he actually named the players. And they were the Black Sox. And then a month later, the Sporting News came out with a story from Ray Schock saying, "Well, I never said this. Why did he pull back?" That was most likely because Comiskey told him not to. And I think Comiskey told him not to because he determined at that point that he was going to try to bring these players back for the 1920 season. So looking at all this, was this a sham investigation? And did Comiskey not have enough evidence to have the Black Sox banned from baseball. I don't think it was a sham investigation per se, because the detectives in particular, I think they really did a really thorough job of trying to infiltrate themselves with the players and with the gamblers as well, and trying to come up with something incriminating. And they never found anything directly incriminating. And plus, they continued spying on Risberg in particular after the 1920 season even started. And I would say if it's a sham investigation, this is a lot of work to put in to just try to give yourself cover. But nonetheless, there are some curious aspects to the whole thing. As far as the question of whether Comiskey had enough evidence to have the Black Sox banned from baseball, an important part of the background of this whole situation was the 1918-1919 investigation of Hal Chase. Now, Hal Chase was a legendary player, particularly as a defensive first baseman. He was also the 1916 National League batting champion. He was a very well-regarded player, and he was a player who was suspected really throughout his career of selling out to gamblers, of taking bribes, of laying down on his team. At one point early in his career, he was accused by his manager of laying down on the team so that he could become manager. Ban Johnson investigated, said he found nothing on Chase, and then what Chase was trying to do came true. He wasn't a manager of the team, so he really got a lot of way with a lot of suspicious behavior. And then what happened was that during the 1918 season, Chase was playing for the Cincinnati Reds, and his manager was the great Christy Mathewson. Late in that season, Mathewson suspended Chase for what he called indifferent play. And Chase didn't play for the Reds anymore. And after the season, the National League scheduled a hearing to investigate these charges. And specifically, they had a charge from a pitcher named Jimmy Ring, who said Chase had offered him money. They had a charge from a pitcher named Paul Parrott, who was pitching for the New York Giants, that Chase had come to him and said, I got some money if you want to, lay down in some games that I'm going to be involved in. And they had Mathewson as well. But unfortunately, by the time the investigation and hearing took place, Mathewson was unavailable. He was in Europe serving in World War I. Parrott had no direct bribe offer to offer. So the case really hinged on Jimmy Ring, who Heidler talked to at length a couple times. And frankly, Ring proved to be a very unreliable witness. He changed the story. He was nervous. He didn't seem convincing. Chase, on the other hand, had brought 3 lawyers with him. Chase was very smooth, very glib. Chase had explanations for giving money to players. He would say, these were young guys and I was just trying to help out. There was nothing nefarious about it. And at the end of the hearing, Heidler tried to kind of have it both ways. He said the Reds were justified in bringing up the charges and criticized Chase for acting in what he called the foolhardy manner. But he acquitted Chase of the charges of game fixing, running to have found Chase guilty on Ring's unsupported testimony would have been impossible. And a lot of people criticized Heidler for that decision then and for really the rest of Heidler's life. And in fact, the criticism continues. I mean, a lot of people think that this is outrageous and that this is an example of how baseball covered up game fixing. And in fact, after these investigations were done, Hal Chase quickly found the New York Giants willing to hire him to play for them in the 1919 season. But Stephen V. Rice, who wrote a good biography, I say this is the Hal Chase Saber biography, it's actually from the Heidler biography. He wrote that Heidler had no choice but to exonerate Chase. An editorial in Baseball magazine explained, Heidler found a massive rumors, half rumors, and bare suspicions mixed in with a few suggestive facts and nothing more. Of evidence in any technical sense, there was none. And without evidence, it would have been a criminal act to blast the reputation of any ball player. Well, a lot of this applies to the Black Sox as well. They did have what Harry Redmond said. They did have what people were talking about. There were kind of suspicious things that happened in the World Series, but there was no real smoking gun. What really turned the tables on the players was when Bill Burns came forward and said that the players, he got the goods on the players, and he knew the inside of the story. But Burns really didn't surface until toward the end of the 1920 season. Perhaps it would have been different if Comiskey or Van Johnson had tried to track down Burns, but they didn't do so. So based on the evidence that they had, I really think that at this point, it would have been very difficult for the players to have been thrown out of baseball at this point. So Comiskey makes the fateful decision to bring these players back, even though some of the detective work was continuing. By January of 1920, which would have been about 3 months into his investigation, he made it clear that he was going to attempt to bring back the 8 suspected players. Now, this included even Chick Gandil. The pursuit of Gandil continued, even though Gandil was really on the outs with Comiskey. He had signaled pretty strongly that he didn't want to play for Comiskey anymore, that he had an offer to be a player manager in the Pacific Coast League. And he also had an offer from an independent league in Idaho to be a player manager there. And he really gave indication that he didn't want to play for Comiskey anymore. Comiskey went after him nonetheless. Swede Risberg was kind of similar. Risberg at one point even announced that he was retiring and wanted to run a restaurant in San Francisco. What Risberg was trying to do was to get a contract with the Pacific Coast League team as well. At the time, the Pacific Coast League was probably the highest minor league. A lot of the players were very well paid, even by major league standards. For players like Risberg, Gandil, and McMullen, who lived on the West Coast, playing in the Pacific Coast League was, relatively speaking, about as good as playing in the major leagues. They would have had no problem if he had sold or made a deal with their teams, with Pacific Coast League teams to unload on these players, but he didn't do so. As far as Joe Jackson was concerned, Comiskey personally sent Harry Grabner down to Georgia to re-sign Jackson. And the players, all the Black Sox except Gandil, re-signed with the team. And all of them generally received pretty substantial raises. Now that looks suspicious to some people even now, but it really isn't. The 1919 season compared to the 1918 season was a very different atmosphere for the White Sox. They were much more successful. They were a 6th place team with horrible attendance in 1918. They were a World Series team with very good attendance in 1919. So naturally, he was going to give players raises. And the raises were really across the board. this wasn't some kind of hush money being played to the players. So there's nothing suspicious about that. But the curious things again to me, I think, were the pursuit of Risberg and Gandil. Harry Grabner says in January of 1920, no, I don't think Risberg will give us any trouble. We have heard stories that he tends to quit the game to go into business, but I doubt such tales. I have heard nothing about Risberg personally, and as far as I know, he'll be back with the team. Kid Gleason writes or says in January of 1920, Gandil will be back at first base, and Risberg will be at short. We will in infield second to none in the American League. They were hot to have these players back, even knowing as much information about them, even secondhand. And that, I think, is pretty surprising to me. So the question becomes, should he have brought these players back? And it's been a controversial decision really ever since he made it. Comiskey has had some defenders, and one of the defenders was a writer named Tim Hornbaker, who wrote a pretty good book called Turning the Black Sox White, The Misunderstood Legacy of Charles A. Comiskey. It's a pretty good book. I recommend reading it. Hornbaker has also written a biography of Shoeless Joe Jackson. It's not as good as David Fleitz's book about Jackson, but it's a pretty good book as well. I think these books are well worth reading. And one of the reasons that Hornbaker wrote the Comiskey book was that he felt that Comiskey was being treated unfairly, that Comiskey did the right thing or was really kind of backed into a corner as far as bringing back these players for the 1920 season. And he writes that team attorney Albert Austrian counseled Comiskey at great length, presenting the various options and relaying his extensive knowledge of the legal system. He knew that slander laws explicitly prevented the White Sox from defaming the reputations of any of the alleged players, and that Comiskey had a lot to lose if he stepped over the line. In fact, he would have been unmercifully targeted in lawsuits that might have crippled him, not only financially, but mentally and physically as well. The inadequate potency of information left no other option but to enter the 1920 season like all the previous years. And that meant contracts were sent out to the entire White Sox roster, including the allegedly tainted players, incredibly, with salary raises. And that, I think, is, a pretty reasonable argument. And I have to say that at the point that I read Hornbaker's book, I thought there was a lot to that argument. And I was a lot more sympathetic toward Comiskey than I had been before. But there is another side to the story. I also talked and interacted via email with Bill Lamb. Bill Lamb wrote what I think really is the definitive book about the Black Sox trials and all the legal proceedings, including the grand jury proceedings, the lawsuits that several Black Sox players filed against Comiskey and Harry Grabner that went on into the 1920s. This is a fantastic book. I think if there is one book that I would recommend reading about the Black Sox scandal, I would say it's this book, Black Sox in the Courtroom. And one of the great things about it is that Bill Lamb is the former state prosecutor in the state of New Jersey. So Bill really knows the story from the inside. He knows what evidence is important. He knows what will hold up in a court of law. He knows the insides and the outsides of the law. So I wrote to Bill and I asked him about Hornbaker's argument defending Comiskey, and he just wasn't buying it. He wrote back that Comiskey felt hamstrung by inclusive proof. Of course, the spin that Comiskey and Austrian put on the situation, but he called it thin soup, in his opinion. The notion that Comiskey and Austrian feared possible defamation lawsuits, he wasn't buying that as well. Bill had a lot of experience with defamation suits, and he felt that this would have gone nowhere. Jackson, Risberg, and Happy Felsch later did try defamation-based suits against Comiskey, and those suits went nowhere. So he's not buying that argument. But I think the important point is in the next paragraph. It also bears remembering that Comiskey was an employer facing a personnel issue, not a prosecutor confined to evidence admissible in a court of law to make the case. Comiskey was not obliged to offer new contracts to Jackson, Williams, Felsch, and Risberg in February of 1920. He chose to do so, as was his prerogative, in the hope that the serious corruption talk would peter out over time. That decision was hardly courageous, but it was understandable. But another sidelight to this was, what if Comiskey had wanted to clean house, but not totally cripple his franchise? So looking at it from Comiskey's point of view, if he just releases all these players and says, I don't want any more to do with these guys anymore, he would, in essence, be committing franchise suicide, which, if you look at what happened to the White Sox after these players were banished for life in the 1920s, that's what actually happened. The White Sox franchise was never the same again. So he really had a lot to lose by just letting the players go. But what if he chose to make deals to get the players off the team, but to get something out of it as well? And there were several possible things that he could have done. In February of 1920, Collier's Eye reported that the White Sox were preparing to send Happy Felsch to the Athletics for a pretty good pitcher named Scott Perry. And they were also going to send Jackson to the Yankees for Home Run Baker. That would have been a bad deal as far as player for player was concerned. But nonetheless, they would have gotten Jackson off the team, and they would have gotten a useful player out of it. The same Collier's Eye also speculated that the White Sox were going to send Gandil and Fred McMullen to the Los Angeles of the Pacific Coast League for a first baseman named Jacques Fournier. Fournier had previously played for the White Sox, gone back to the Pacific Coast League, and subsequent to this, he came back to the National League with the Brooklyn Dodgers and St. Louis Cardinals. And Fournier was actually a really good player. He had several excellent seasons in the National League in the 1920s. That would have been a pretty good deal for the White Sox to make. On February 14th, the Chicago Tribune reports that the Yankees were offering first baseman Wally Pipp to the White Sox for Felsch. Pipp, who would become famous as the guy who lost his job to Lou Gehrig several years later, was another guy who was a really excellent player and would have helped the White Sox a lot. That would have actually been a pretty even deal to trade Pipp for Happy Felsch. The White Sox held off on that deal. They were trying to get a pitcher for Felsch if they were going to trade him at all. Why were they trying to get a pitcher for Felsch instead of a first baseman? Because they thought they were going to get Chick Gandil back. And of course, that never happened. So again, the question becomes, why didn't the White Sox try to deal Risberg and Gandil to a West Coast minor league team, something that both players would have welcomed? And why did the White Sox bring back Fred McMullen, a valuable utility player, but hardly a replaceable part? Now, Fred McMullen, he's sometimes dismissed as kind of a spare part in this whole World Series next thing. There are stories that he just heard about the scandal. He had incriminating information. So he said, deal me in, otherwise I'm going to squawk and break the scandal open. So they cut him on. But McMullen's involvement with the scandal was actually fairly substantial. He actually did the scouting report. He was sent unknowingly by Kid Gleason to spy on the Cincinnati Reds. And he brought back the scouting report on the Reds that was totally biased. It included all kinds of untrue information. The players who would later be known as the Clean Sox actually used this scouting information against the Cincinnati Reds and really had a hard time hitting their pitchers because they had all this bad information from Fred McMullen. During the 1920 season, we found out later that Fred McMullen was likely the bag man who was the intermediary between the gamblers and the suspected players, offering them bribes during the 1920 season to sell out more games. So again, Fred McMullen, he was central to this whole thing. Not bringing him back would have left a reasonably valuable utility man, but nothing more. But nonetheless, Comiskey wanted to bring back him as well. And this was extremely foolhardy. Now the question becomes, would other teams have been willing to make a deal for the players under suspicion, even if Comiskey had shared the results of his own investigation to this point? And I would have to say, particularly looking at what happened with players like Hal Chase, these guys who are under suspicion, even players like Chase, who there was good reason to think these guys are crooked through and through, they never had trouble finding another team. Hal Chase, as I mentioned, after this big investigation by John Heidler after the 1918 season, he got snapped up by John McGraw and the New York Giants and was selling out games again up until the end of the very season. These guys never had problems finding employment. So I think if Comiskey had said, you know, I have some incriminating, but not totally incriminating evidence about these players, it's caveat emptor. I don't think there would have been any trouble making these kinds of deals. But nonetheless, he made the decision to bring all these guys back, except for Gandil. As I pointed out, this was not for lack of trying. And he paid the price for it, and so did the White Sox. So the aftermath of this decision, 7 of the 8 players come back. It's a really good team again. They battle the Indians and the New York Yankees all season long for the American League pennant. Even though several of the Black Sox later admit that they were continuing to throw games during the 1920 season, that's a big focus of my book. The Sox nearly repeat as the American League champion. The scandal finally breaks open in the final days of the season, and the players end up being indicted along with several of the lower level gamblers. After the season, with the scandal out in the open and the grand jury investigating, MLB owners elect Judge Landis as baseball's first commissioner in November. Landis might have become commissioner as early as February of 1920, but his candidacy was blocked by Ban Johnson, who feared Landis as a rival for authority in baseball, and who basically vetoed the whole proposal of Landis coming in that early. It's interesting to speculate what would have happened if Landis had become commissioner as early as February. I really think Landis would have gotten on top of this whole thing much earlier, and the whole story would have been much different. But of course, that didn't happen. So the players are suspended. They end up being banished for life. And without those players, the White Sox finish in 7th place in 1921. They don't return to the first division until 1936, and they don't win another pennant for 40 years. I mean, this is Charles Comiskey's nightmare. This is why I think he chose to bring the guys back. And you could understand his fears, and you could understand why he did it. It doesn't justify him doing it, but you can understand why he made that decision. So what is Charles Comiskey's legacy? He spends the 1920s trying to rebuild his shattered franchise. He spends a lot of money. He spends $100,000 buying a third baseman named Willie Cam. He buys a shortstop named Bill Sissel. He brings in other players with pretty good minor league reputations. Nothing works. He makes Eddie Collins the player manager. That doesn't work out. He makes Ray Schalk the player manager. That doesn't work out. He makes Frank Chance, the peerless leader of the Cubs, the manager for a short time. That doesn't work out either. Chance ended up dying before he could manage the team. Nothing works out. So the 1920s are a nightmare for Comiskey. Meanwhile, even though he was a sympathetic figure when this scandal first broke, a lot of the Black Sox players, particularly Jackson and Weaver, start talking about what a raw deal they got from Comiskey. Jackson starts spinning these stories about how he tried to tell about the scandal. They wouldn't listen to him. Weaver keeps saying, I didn't know anything about it. I played well in the series. I shouldn't have been suspended. He keeps asking for reinstatement, and it gets a lot of sympathy. And the nation's press, which had been pretty sympathetic to Comiskey at the start, starts turning against him. By the time he dies in 1931, many people consider him a broken man. He really had a miserable time of it. You could say he made his own bed, but it's, I think, a sad story. One of the many sad stories of this whole scandal. Comiskey gets inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1939. He's one of the early inductees, but the stories of his tight-fisted ways, which were enhanced a lot by Elliot Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out, and the movie of the same name, continue to reverberate. We now know that many of the criticisms of Comiskey were based on inaccurate information, and that many of the charges leveled against him by the 8 Spanish players were of doubtful veracity. One of the critics of Comiskey was the famous player's lawyer, Marvin Miller. He's quoted at one point that we don't know to what degree the Comiskey's mean-spiritedness contributes to the players selling out. He says, the question isn't why isn't Joe Jackson in the Hall of Fame, but why isn't Comiskey out? That's the kind of vitriol that Comiskey was subject to after his death. I would have to say that although Comiskey's decision to bring back the Black Sox in 1920 was understandable, given everything that he stood to lose and ended up losing, it will always remain a black mark against him. He did some things, he should have done more. It's a sad story for everybody involved, including Charles Comiskey. So that's my story. Big thanks to the Saber Black Sox Committee, people like Jacob Pomrecki, Bill Lamb, Bruce Allardyce in particular, were enormously helpful to my work. A number of people helped me with this project. The Chicago History Museum, the Chicago Public Library, the San Diego Public Library. They were extremely helpful. The Hall of Fame was as well. My publisher is Roman and Littlefield. And I hope you can check out the book. Thank you. And now I'll take questions and comments.
Great. Well, thank you. Wonderful presentation. I guess, first of all, how can people get the book?
Well, it is available on Amazon. You can also order it directly from the publisher. I will say I've got my email at the end of the, oh, hang on a minute. Let me bring my screen up again. My email is here on the last slide. You can get a 30% discount ordering it directly from the publisher. And I will be happy to send anybody who emails me a coupon for ordering it directly from the publisher for a 30% discount. And it's really even a better deal than Amazon. If you order from Amazon, you have to pay full price. So this is the best deal, but the book is available. I'm not sure about, frankly, about bookstore availability.
Great. So questions?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
When I was with Elliot Asanoff at his house in 2003, he gave me the whole story about 8 Men Out, how is him as a dramatic playwright, how he came up with the angle for Comiskey's cheapness. And that was, he had to do as a playwright. If most people know how he got into the 8 Men Out, he had written a screenplay that was banned by Major League Baseball because they were a sponsor of CBS. It was called The Witness. And it's really sad that that was sort of the dramatic license he took. And I believe I became very close to the Comiskey family. I got to go to the 100th celebration of Comiskey Park in 2010 with the family. And I just feel the narrative about him being cheap has really miscast the story.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Jacob Pomrecki, who's really done amazing work with the Black Sox committee, he talks about 8 Men Out as a historical novel, kind of like the book, what's the book by Truman Capote, In Cold Blood, where he uses real life characters, but kind of fashions the story around him. That's really what happened up there.
Yeah, I think your comment is appropriate. I think, again, that was his dramatic hook that the players, were, why they did what they did. So I look forward to reading your book. Sounds like you did some great work. I think the 1920 season is still the unhidden stuff. How much were they throwing games in 1920 is still something I think that needs to be further explored.
Yeah. In the book, I go through the season game by game, and there's a lot of games that look suspicious. I think I've interacted with Bruce Allardyce a lot. Bruce, I think, is correct in saying that the number of games that they tossed during the 1920 season was likely relatively small. I think that's probably correct, but I would say there could be as many as a dozen. Some people say less, some people say more, but there's a lot of suspicious behavior that goes on throughout the entire season.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. And by the way, enjoyed your presentation, Don. Yeah, the whole thing about Comiskey being cheap, he had never been accused of being cheap before 1919. After 1919, as you said, he paid Willie Cam $100,000 for Willie Cam, who was a pretty good third baseman, but no Lefty Grove or home run Baker, certainly. There was nothing in his history except really the mutterings of a few disgruntled players from the 1919 scandal that Comiskey was underpaying his players. And all the evidence is just the other way around.
Yeah, and I think the only thing about Comiskey is that, if he could sign you for a price, he was going to sign you for that price and hold you to it. He wasn't going to, he wasn't just going to give money away, because he wasn't, the thing always remember about Comiskey is he didn't come from a background, he wasn't Wrigley with a big gump company in the background. He wasn't like owners that had another source of revenue. Everything he built up through baseball. And so, even when he built his stadium, the thing that people don't realize is, if you ever watch it, looking through the papers, there was like a budget. He never announced the budget, but anytime there would be talks of, oh, he's going to add all this and the budget's going to climb to, over 500,000, bingo, it would be chopped. It would be all of a sudden these magnificent additions weren't there, because he always wanted to pretend he had more money than he actually had access to. It's one of the things to under, but he wasn't necessarily cheap. He just, but
no. Yeah, he really wasn't. But one thing about Comiskey and Harry Grabner was some of these guys were on multi-year contracts, and he held them to it. Like Buck Weaver in particular, after the 1918 season, he signed a 3-year contract with the White Sox for, I think, like $70 to $100 a year. After he had a good year, in 1919, he wanted more money. And in fact, he spent the winter in Los Angeles playing golf with Babe Ruth, who was trying to do the same thing. Babe Ruth had a 3-year contract with the Red Sox that had just started with the 1919 season. Ruth was putting a lot of pressure on the Red Sox. And then after his deal with the Yankees, trying to put pressure on the Yankees to get more money. Ruth succeeded, but Comiskey and Grabner helped hold firm against Jackson or against Weaver.
Yeah.
And Weaver held out against him. Weaver had some grudges.
Yeah, the modern Chicago comparison still goes back 20 years, but it was Scottie Pippen's contract where he was perfectly happy to get the security and get the good contract. But then all of a sudden, when he advances to a level that maybe even he didn't anticipated, he all of a sudden is upset because, gee, these other guys I'm better than, I'm not getting paid as much for. But, if the question would be if he got injured or if he didn't rise to that level, would he have returned the money? I don't think so. So, it's a gamble.
Guys, I have a question about 8 Men Out. It's now recognized as historical fiction. I don't know if that term existed when the book came out or how it was marketed, but I get the impression Asimov wasn't trying or never claimed to be the definitive be-all, end-all about the Black Sox scandal, but yet the public just absorbed it as though it was gospel. Without questioning anything. How come?
Well, there really was no other information that I could think of. I mean, when that book came out, I think it was 1963.
Yeah.
There had been nothing new about the Black Sox in decades. It literally was a cold case. And he really put a lot of information in the book that nobody had ever heard before. And he did talk to Felsch. I don't know who else he talked to. David would know more about this than I would. But I mean, there really was a lot of groundbreaking information in the book. And it's such a fascinating story. I mean, it's one of the great crime stories of all time, among other things. I mean, there's people like Arnold Rothstein involved in it. And you see the John Sayles movie, and you can see why this makes an entertaining and interesting movie.
Right.
I mean, there's all these interesting, compelling characters. I mean, it's irresistible.
Some people
there was nothing else.
Believe it.
Yeah. You think about it, there's a reference to this thing in The Great Gatsby of all things, the great American novel. Right. There's an indirect reference to the Black Sox scandal. Or actually a direct reference, the thought of, taking the, yeah.
Perfect. Any other questions? I saw a number of great comments praising the presentation in the chat. So there are a few references to what salaries were back then to today's dollars. So if you can get in there and take a quick look at that, that's some interesting facts to share. So.
Yeah, I would recommend that anybody interested in the scandal, well, first of all, buy my book. But secondly, join the Saber Black Sox Scandal Committee. It's fantastic. And one of the benefits of being on the committee, and I think probably you even need to be a member of the committee, but the newsletters of the committee, which go back a number of years now, every one of those newsletters contains fantastic information, like the story about the shipyards, these players working in shipyards during the 1918 season. Somebody wrote an article in one of the Black Sox Scandal Committee newsletters, really look into it and finding out the real story. A lot of this stuff is just amazing, groundbreaking information.
Yeah.
These newsletters come out twice a year. They're really fantastic. I recommend the committee to anybody.
And not to forget our own Bruce Allardyce's great work on all the gamblers. I mean, I almost wonder if Bruce was one of the gamblers himself. Did you know all these guys, Bruce? How much did you lose on the series? What's going on here?
Well, I partially financed my college education by playing poker. But I won't say I was a good gambler. The thing was, I was usually sober at 3 o'clock in the morning and, playing a bunch of drunks. So I could, I didn't make any money before midnight, but after then I made a fortune. So,
Well, Bruce is also talking from an undisclosed location. So.
Yes.
Right.
Don, I'm very impressed by your book. I put a couple notes just wondering, Dave is very close with Sox ownership. I've long been close with Cub ownership. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and you cite this in your presentation about the amount of attendance going into ball games, and I'm kind of wondering, my great-grandmother was a victim of the Spanish flu, and before this season, when I had talked to various baseball folks, I said the ramp up's going to be slow before we get rear ends into the ballpark, and it devastated Charlie Wiegman. That was, there was a lot of things that hit Wiegman, but the combination of bad losing money to Bruce, owing money to Bruce and his hitmen, and then the anti-German sentiment during World War I and the Spanish flu were all a kind of a killer cocktail for Wiegman to lose his ownership of the Cubs and to see William Wrigley, or as we've all come to know, other folks buy into the Cubs to get Wiegman out. I'm wondering what your thoughts were just on that one little note about the influenza and the impact of that on baseball attendance during that time period.
Oh, it was crippling. I mean, the war itself would have been bad enough, but one of the reasons that the owners decided for the 1919 season to only play 140 games was that with the flu still raging, they weren't sure that fans were going to come back. They had no idea how baseball was going to survive in the 1919 season. So they cut the season short to 140 games. And as kind of a hedge to make a little bit more money on the other end, they expanded the World Series to best of 9 games, which had only been done once back in 1903. So there was a lot of doubt about, how baseball would be received during the 1919 season. And when you think about Comiskey's payroll for 1919, after all this uncertainty and after all, what a horrible season the White Sox had had in 1918, he was extremely generous in 1919.
Does that go to the argument, though, that perhaps in extenuating circumstance, and Don, the worst thing anyone can do is speculate on a book they have yet to read, but is it fair to say that some of the signings were done just to make sure he didn't lose his ass and that he would have an ability to put butts in seat for the 1920 season to make up for losses of 1919? Is that it? Would that simple economics fly into?
Oh yeah, decision? Yeah. There's a lot. I'm sure that had a lot to do with it. My point about the moves that he didn't make but could have, were that he would have gotten value for players that he wanted off the team. Like if you wanted to get rid of Chick Gandil, you could have gotten a decent first baseman in exchange for him.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you wanted to trade Joe Jackson, there would have been some takers and they would have gotten something valuable in return.
Yeah.
Instead, he went on the drain with these guys. And really, if you look at the White Sox before and after, just think about the Comiskey family that owned the team until Belvec bought it. Through 1919, 1920, very successful franchise. One of the most profitable franchises in baseball. Kings of Chicago, unquestioned leaders. Comiskey, revered figure. For the next 40 years, they paid the price for bringing these guys back. The team was crippled on the field. People didn't like the family. And it was just a night and day difference for the rest of the Comiskey ownership. It really wasn't until Frank Lane came in the late 1940s that the franchise finally got out of the doldrums.
Yeah.
John, my hat's off to you. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment about the pandemic that my colleague Brian brought up. If Red Faber hadn't gotten the Spanish flu, there wouldn't have been a Black Sox scandal.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. 'Cause he could not pitch in the 1990 World Series. And they were dependent on Williams and Seacott. In fact, after game 2, Kid Gleason is convinced that these guys are on the fix. And then the question becomes, should I not use them the rest of the series? But how could he not use Seacott and Williams? He really had nobody else to pitch,
Right.
except for Dickie Kerr.
Oh, yeah.
So the fact that he didn't have Faber, that was extremely crippling. And I think that's absolutely true, that there would have been no fix
Right.
had Faber been available.
He got the flu when he was at the Great Lakes Naval Yard.
Yeah.
And my high school classmate Brian Cooper wrote a great biography about Red Faber.
Yeah.
Fletch with the assist.
Yeah. If you look at the White Sox in just the regular season in 1919, even though they put up the great record, by the last like 2 months, it was clear that if it wasn't Seacott or Williams starting, and especially Seacott, they weren't even going to win the game. The rest of the pitching staff by those last 2 months had just collapsed. And so it was kind of an obvious and easy target to the gamblers that like there was just this huge weakness there. I mean, the one thing you do find out, if out of all those players, if Comiskey could have gotten one back for the 20s, you wouldn't choose Joe Jackson. You would choose Eddie Seacott. Seacott was, he was the player. He was incredibly valuable. And he's actually the guy who, had he stayed around another 4 or 5 years, he would have been in the Hall of Fame. He was that good. But he's the one that left. I just wanted to mention, Don, I put in the notes, I didn't put it here. This is sort of I've looked at this for a long time, and as much as I always thought like, wow, it was just a straight crash from the scandal to just 40 years in the wilderness, I don't think it quite works like that, because what happened was Comiskey, I think people here would have liked Comiskey as an owner because he was always willing to spend. So yes, he does go out, he uses his contacts to get Ted Lyons. He gets Willie Cam, who's good, maybe not worth 100,000, but a good player. And they do, you're right, they don't get to the first division, but they do get to like 500 or so. And this is like the mid 1920s. And if he was still doing things, I think they would have improved later in the 1920s. The problem is, and this is hard to tell, but around the mid 1920s is all of a sudden when, Comiskey kind of gets sick, kind of starts taking himself away from the team, and the management turns over to his son, Lou, who's liked but inexperienced. It took a while for Lou, and Grabner, who I think is the same thing. I mean, Grabner was brilliant in many ways, but I think he wasn't the baseball talent judge in the 1920s. And that's when you really see the collapse, kind of where, Comiskey was always willing to spend. Once it was out of his hands, they weren't going to spend any more on players. And it just kind of, went to pot then. But by the mid 1920s, their attendance had almost recovered. Like they had a great season attendance wise in, I think it was 1925, 1920. They had sort of built themselves back up. And then, but with Comiskey gone, that kind of was the final nail.
Dennis, you have a question.
Don, you're talking about the trades. Is it possible that Comiskey was concerned? He had enough suspicions to investigate. He may not have been 100% sold that these guys didn't sell out the game. And could he have possibly been concerned about his reputation, that he had traded some of these guys? This all came up and it all blew up on him, that he was dumping these players on other teams. And was he somewhat nervous about being caught in that kind of situation?
I think that's a good point. On the other hand, they had a terribly disappointing World Series. If he had not brought back Seacott and Williams, for instance, they had pitched, Williams in particular, in the 8th game, had pitched poorly that a lot of people didn't think he was going to be a good pitcher anymore. So I think if he had gotten rid of those guys, there wouldn't have been. The guys he would really gotten a lot of heat about, I think, were Jackson and Weaver. But again, to reiterate this point, the three guys that he tried to bring back that I think are inexcusable are Gandil, Risberg, McMullen. McMullen is, you tell me why he wanted the guy back. And Gandil and Risberg, they didn't want to play for the White Sox a whole lot. I mean, Risberg was on a multi-year contract they didn't like. He would have been happy to go back to the Pacific Coast League. Gandil had basically burned his bridges and was ready to go back to playing on the West Coast. I don't think there would have been a big brouhaha if those three guys were gone, and that might have helped the story as well. So, but he didn't take any of the steps.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I know everybody's going to split and go their own way the rest of the day. So first of all, thank you for joining us. And again, thanks to our two presenters, outstanding information. I mentioned earlier that our next get together, we're going to be live.
Face.
We're going to give it a shot. Saturday, June 26th, Murphy's Bleacher. The address is 3655 North Sheffield. It's right behind the iconic scoreboard at Wrigley Field. The Cubs are out of town, so we won't be fighting any crowds from the game day. But the plan is to be there at noon, and it'll be nice to see a lot of familiar faces in person again. So we'll have more information out as we get a little bit closer on some more of the specifics, or whatever. We're still in an evolving situation if anything else comes up, but we'll make sure that there's another invitation out for everybody if you haven't already RSVP'd.
Bill, it's been a long time since I've been to Murphy's. Do they still have the scale model of Wrigley in there somewhere?
And you know what? It's been a long time for me too. So we'll find out in June, right?
Okay.
So, well, perfect. Well, thanks everybody.
Hello.
That's it. We can certainly hang around and chat for a little while. If you need to leave, feel free. It's been a pleasure seeing everybody again.
Yeah. Enjoyed it. Oh,
Perfect. Now leave it going if people want to chat for a bit. So
maybe Brian Sandberg will show up.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Can I ask a question?
That might have been a one-time thing. So
can I ask about getting back together live? I'm with the president of the Keltner chapter, and I got a survey out trying to find out how our members feel. I know they want to get together, just how we're going to do that. Did you guys, I think you guys had a survey out as well. Did that help on making a decision for live or?
Well, we started thinking about that a little bit before that survey had gone out. Specifically kind of looking at June, we weren't quite sure on the details, if it was going to be just like a suburban park somewhere, forest preserve, to get people to spread out. But as the city of Chicago started to change in response to some of the CDC guidance, that's where we kind of went in that direction. So, and then obviously it's still a little way out, so we're watching the birds. We're going to be really conscious of that. So as we get a little bit closer, but yeah.
I know we're planning a book club meeting outdoors because we're reading A Year of Playing Catch. We figured how much better than talking about a book about playing catch and playing catch. So that's our first scheduled, but it's not
Dennis, are you
scheduled.
going to toss the book
plan.
around? Are you going to toss the book around? Yeah. Anybody who's pretty, one copy of the book, then you toss it to whoever's turn is to talk about it next. Awesome.
Everybody signs it.
I hope they don't toss it to me because I can't throw a frisbee, and it sounds like throwing a frisbee. So, okay, thanks.
I have to admit, it sure beats tossing computer monitors around.
That is true. I would much rather be hit by a book.
I have a question for Don.
Go ahead.
See you guys.
One of your
thank you for joining us.
One of your slides said that Comiskey sent, I think, Gribner to Georgia to re-sign Jackson. Was that supposed to say he sent him to South Carolina, or was Jackson in Georgia for some
He was actually in Savannah, Georgia that winter.
Okay.
Was it in the Pennsylvania? Was it in Pennsylvania?
Oh, I'm sorry. Is that a question for Don or
Yeah, I'm asking, was it in Pennsylvania?
in Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
No.
Not that I'm
Well,
aware
it might
of.
be in Georgia.
Yeah, I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, Georgia. Okay, yes, I got it.
Okay.
Yes, Georgia, yeah, Georgia. All right. Okay.
Perfect.
That's good, yeah, all right.
Great.
I do know Jackson's wife, Katie, had family in Georgia, Savannah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's why he had a home down there in Savannah. So I think he moved to South Carolina a little bit later.
Okay.
And that's where he ran the liquor store, and made Thai cob there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Well, thank you all very much. Don, again, great job. Richard, it's always good to see you. Mr. Hanson, it's always an honor. I think Saber's done a great job today. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And I saw your note, so we'll be in touch.
I appreciate that, please.
Absolutely.
Take care. Be well.
Perfect.
Good to see you, Brian.
All right. Well, I mean, if that's it, we can call it a day. It's been a pleasure.
Call it a day. Everybody enjoy.
Yep. The video will be available soon once Jacob does a little bit of editing at the beginning. So
Yeah. Bill, can you make sure I get a link to that? Because I mean, literally, people have been asking, and then one of the questions was, how can I get a link to that? One of the people asking me was former White Sox executive Don Evans.
Okay.
Dan Evans, who was like, he wanted to know, and I said, okay, I don't know, when I find out where it is, you'll find out where it is. So I'll be sending it out to these people, saying, okay, here's the link. Here's how you can get at it.
Yep. As soon as Jacob lets me know, I'll make sure you get it.
Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent.
Very good.
Goodbye,
Well, thanks,
guys.
everybody.
Great talk, Don. Good to see you. Always enjoy your books.
Yeah, good to see you guys. Good to see you.
All right. Okay.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Good to see you, Rich. Bye.
All right, bye, guys. Bye.
Bye. Have a good one.
Bye.
You too. Bye. Bye.